queuing up. All right, we're in here. All right, good deal. Well,
All right.
yeah, we're gonna kind of just take some time to say hello to each other here. Give people some time to jump into the feed and jump online here. Um, so, Roy, let me make sure I say your name right. It's Roy Villareal, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And I'm here with Jeremy Lee Quinn. Of course, I'm CJ. We're doing a follow up from our experience at the border. We actually heard a podcast that you were in with Theo Vaughn, which was incredibly informative, but also hilarious. You guys really had a dynamic chemistry on that audio. And but I got to say, Jeremy and I were both just we were down in Yuma actually heading to the border, and we were both blown away by some of the info that you're able to share now. Um, so, uh, you know, Drew, what do you think? We just let Roy give everyone a chance to kind of tell us about himself and kind of jump into things here.
Sure. I'll give you a quick rundown of who I am. I recently retired from the U.S. Border Patrol. I retired as the Chief of Collision of the Tucson sector. I spent 32 years in the Border Patrol. Moved around, I think it was 8 or 9 different times. I've worked along the southwest border in various locations. I've also included up at headquarters in Washington, D.C., so I understand, as we refer to it, proverbially the swamp. I've also had 4 deployments. I've worked in Mexico City for quite some time.
The
Uh,
actual swamp.
the actual swamp sometimes, yeah. Um, but overall, when it relates to my experience and career, I mean, it's been about border security. That's been the main focus. But in the process of that, I think as a young man, a young agent, you're focused on the security aspect. And as you grow and mature and begin to experience life, you realize that it's not just the security aspect, it's the politics, but it's also the fact that you're dealing with humanity. And so you become a little more polished as it relates to the full spectrum of what's happening along our borders.
Now, can I just ask one thing that came to mind just now as you're talking? You're able to talk to us now because you had a 30-year plus career in Arizona and different parts of the border, but you can talk to us freely now. One thing that we miss is we miss the element of transparency. For example, when we try to talk to the government, and what do you think can happen as far as conversations and transparency? How might that benefit us understanding the real situation at the border?
What's interesting when you mentioned the term transparency, having worked for multiple administrations, Republican, Democrat, I've noticed that transparency varies from administration to administration. Some administrations are a lot more open or free from the perspective of they allow the border patrol or the leadership in the field to speak openly, and others are a lot more restrictive. But it really depends upon that the who's sitting in the White House and how much control they want to have. As it relates to transparency, one of the key things I think that's happened for the U.S. Border Patrol in the last year and a half has been access, or I shouldn't say access, but the actual adoption of social media.
Hmm.
Through the U.S. Border Patrol on Instagram and on Facebook and Twitter, you'll notice that there are a lot more chiefs who are now on the social media platforms, and they're trying to put out as much information as they can. It's not everything they'd like to put out, but it's a lot more free going compared to what it used to be.
Yeah. Now, one of the things I've been curious about, because we spoke to a gentleman who was right around 23 years, if I remember correct, who was getting close to retirement. He said he had about 3 more years and he was going to retire from the Border Patrol down there in the San Luis area. Off camera, off mic, we had an incredibly candid conversation, which was incredibly informative. And then we asked, would we be able to talk about anything like this on camera? And he was like, absolutely not. We wouldn't have this conversation at all. And what Jeremy's talking about really, I think, hits a point that there's a lot of speculation down there on the border. And one of the things you said, I think, really draws it to what we're really looking to explore is a humanitarian aspect. Because to use a term that Jeremy was right on point with it, this political football aspect, right? Like it's become a more of a back and forth between who's in office, who's not, and then what's going to change, what's not going to change. But we're really curious about what's really changing. So the question I'd have for you, wanted to start off here is, I mean, I have tons, trust me, I'm super, I want to jump into your brain here, boss. But the administrations, you've gone through a handful of them. So what are some of the major changes you've seen in light of the current administration looking back?
Well, so for me, I came into the Border Patrol in the late 80s, 1988. And back then, that was just after IRCA, the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, which is supposed to be the fix all for illegal migration. I forget the total number of millions that were legalized, and then there was chain migration associated with those folks that legalized. But that was the solution. Mass legalization and amnesty, worksite enforcement, the creation of visas. And so when I came into the border security world at that point, we were still recovering from a lot of folks that were still trying to apply for IRCA. And then lo and behold, 4 years or 2 to 4 years later, illegal migration starts to pick up again. So it seems as though what happens, and this is my personal opinion, what happens on the political sphere is there is never a true effort to fix the entire immigration system. And you have to look at it from both perspectives, border security aspect and also the humanitarian aspect. They go hand in hand, the legal migration part. If you're able to develop a legal migration system that addresses a lot of the needs and the wants of the world, there are a lot of people that want to come to the United States. It's the greatest country in the world. A lot of opportunity, the ability to escape certain turmoil, whether it's warfare, economic, whatever it may be. The U.S. is safe haven. What is lacked is the ability of our elected officials to craft a well-rounded immigration reform package that includes the legal aspect. And if you can remove a lot of the, in my business we used to call the noise, the chatter, which is criminal, the illegal migration, through a legal process, then it allows the border security experts to really focus on border security. And then we can make, I say we as in the U.S. government, can make sound decisions, financial decisions in regards to what we deploy at the border, the type of technology, the manpower, the aircraft, everything. So over the years, we talk about the administration. When I first came into the Border Patrol, there was little to no attention to border security. Because we were out of sight, out of mind. There were about 2,500, maybe 3,000 agents nationwide, and that includes Canada and the Mexican border. It was through Bill Clinton's administration, Janet Reno, who to this day remains my favorite attorney general, who began to focus on controlling the border. That's when the investment in border security began, creating access roads, infrastructure for roads and for lights and fencing. That was the first time that we truly had any sort of investment into erecting fencing, or what today we call wall. So from the late 80s up until President Trump assumed office, it was known as fencing. And then as soon as President Trump assumed, President became wall. So with each successive administration, we witnessed different changes from how the enhancement of border security takes place, whether it's the infusion of manpower. Back in the late 80s, 2,500, 3,000 agents. When I retired last year, there were over 20,000 agents. Tremendous growth in manpower. Budget-wise, we're talking hundreds of millions back in the late 80s, early 90s, to almost $1 billion in 2020.
That was 4 billion, you said, right? You kind of cut out there.
Yeah, 4 billion. So it's a
Wow.
tremendous investment, both in personnel, both in finances, technology, and resources. So with each successive administration, you see these piecemeal efforts that we can, we'll throw money at border security, but we don't invest in the legalization part. And the politics of Washington, D.C. also sway what type of investment takes place, whether it's going to be technology or manpower or anything else.
Yeah.
And can you tell us something about the robust legal immigration aspect of it? Why is that important to address, and why is comprehensive immigration reform such an important key element to all of this?
Yeah, so, I mean, lessons learned. Again, you look at IRCA, 1986, the tendency that it was going to solve illegal migration. There will always be a need and a desire to migrate or immigrate to the United States. And what we need to do as a country is to recognize, how do we match that need, not only of foreigners from throughout the world, but also the needs of the United States. When you look at the late 60s and 70s, our country was labor intensive. We needed fresh manpower, fresh labor to come in and help with agriculture, the service industry. And as we progressed as a country, our industry has changed less from manpower intensive into brain intensive. So what we need today are more individuals that are engineers, from technology gurus, and so on and so forth. So the value of legal migration is, if it's done right, is that you can solve both two parts. One is those that want to come to the United States legally. Um, you can meet a need or a gap that we have in our country, and also just the fact that we have people that want to migrate through reunification. Folks that want to be reunified with brothers and sisters and mom and dad who've already been here for decades. And at the end of the day, there is still a need for agriculture. And this isn't in any way prejudicial or racist. When we look at those that are working in that industry, a lot of folks that come in that industry are coming from America. Part of it is generational in that they recognize that here's a workforce or a career path that they've been invested in, and then they bring up sons and brothers and sisters. So we have to look at some sort of mechanism for a comprehensive legal migration system.
Now, one of the things that we did discuss with the gentleman down on the border, just on this side in San Luis, was the incredible spike of the need for workers down in the border areas for a lot of the crops that are coming in. And he said there was Jeremy, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's an uptick of about 20,000 jobs that were going to be needed come September. And the issue they were having was that they couldn't process enough people to actually do the work. So they had this massive influx of illegal aliens that came through. And of course, that turned into not just an issue with border situations, but then, of course, the work conditions where the pay rate, hours of work, things of that nature. And Jeremy and I were kind of curious, what is in play right now to help streamline and kind of smooth out that work visa situation, or to help with kind of the necessity of the travel, like on either side of the border, because we saw it from both sides. Our hosts actually own a home in Yuma, live in Yuma, but own a business in Mexico, and they work the other way. So there's, it's a service from both sides of the border.
Yeah, that's a great example. When you look at our borders, you have to recognize that our borders are dynamic. Although there is a demarcation of what the border is, the border environment is very fluid and extremely dynamic. When I worked in the Imperial Valley in Central California, every day at about 2 or 3 in the morning, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of workers that would come from across the border and then wait to start their work in the morning. And the Imperial Valley is largely agricultural. And so these individuals lived in Mexicali, right across the border, across every night, and then every morning they worked and then went home. In Yuma, same thing. There's a huge agricultural industry there, lettuce and carrots and stuff of that nature.
Right.
This is a great. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm just going to say we're going to take a little break for a second because we're having some static issues on the sound from your end. So we're going to step out from we're just going to step away from the street, and CJ, you'll talk a little bit about all this stuff, and we're going to see if we can fix the sound real quick.
Sure.
That works? Okay.
Yeah, man.
All right, just remove us from the stream, and then we'll.
All right. Ray, don't feel bad. Or Roy, don't feel bad about this. This is what we deal with all the time. And being technologies, forget about it.
We're just going to see if we can fix this real quick, and we'll be right back.
Yeah. All right.
So
I'm going to get you guys out there 1 second. And there we go. So while I've got you guys for a little bit, what I'm hoping to have, what we're hoping to accomplish today, this guy is, like I said, a 32-year veteran of the Border Patrol, just an incredible resource of knowledge. So what I'm hoping we can accomplish is to get some real answers to questions that you might have, along with many that I have, and we can dig deep on these. This isn't going to be just a matter of, what we saw. It's going to be a matter of what he experienced. And I mean, this guy has gone everything from wild animals to massive border surges, like we were talking about earlier. Different administrations. He's gone through the climates from top to bottom. The stories this guy can tell are amazing. Roy is just an incredible resource when it comes down to all things involved with not just the U.S.-Mexico border, but like you said, he was up north as well. So he's had experience in both ends of it here. And so what we're hoping to accomplish at this point is just to kind of, dig deeper, and I know that some of the things that Jeremy and I experienced while we were down on the border a couple of weeks back, just a small taste of what Roy's had a chance to see, and what he's been able to really kind of comprehensively look at is the real root of a lot of what this immigration is all about. It's not just a matter of, a couple, people, not a couple, but, a bunch of people lined up across the border in Mexico from Mexico looking to come into America, but people that are coming from all over the world. And that was one of the things that blew my mind was how much money is being paid. These coyotes and a lot of the cartels, which we're going to talk about here, are making, it's a $billions industry, $1 billion+ industry, getting folks across the border from countries like, India, Somalia, Afghanistan, from all these different places, people that are on watch lists, people from all over the world that would never have had a spot, on the list potentially to get across the border. And that's what we're going to talk about too is, what's really going on? Is it, are we looking at it from a criminal standpoint, work, is it just a quality of life? I know a lot of people that we experienced were in situations where their quality of life was just horrific and they're just looking for, a better chance at, like living, because some of them aren't even able to do that. Uh, Danger Labrie 13 over on YouTube says maybe it's time for a legitimate wall. Well, I can say that we saw the wall, and I'm going to show you this real fast. So um, this is what the wall looks like actually, and I'll probably pull this up again. This is the effectiveness of the wall. So we're looking at it. We have the end of the wall right here, right? So this is right up on the Cocopah Indian Reservation, and that road, what you're seeing right there is, so to the left here. Let me go up here real fast. Boom. So to the right of that wall, there we go. On the left side there, what you're seeing is just a road that drives straight back into Yuma, Arizona. The wall continues, it doglegs the 90 degrees to the right there and heads down, continues southeast. Um, and then you've got, if you continue to look as we check out, it's a legitimate wall. I mean, that thing's a good, 18, 20 feet tall, solid steel. And then in that steel, you've got a, it's filled with concrete. So you can kind of hear me telling you about it right there. And now on the right side of this is just a canal. The wall stops right there. So the access to either side of the wall is what you're seeing right now. The interesting part about it is this isn't the actual border. The border, if we continue to look in that direction, so what you're looking at is you're looking directly into Mexico on that side. And that the little canal there is what divides, what they're calling a divide. But in all fairness, if you go past that canal by quite a bit, you're going to see that out there. I mean, I couldn't put into miles or yards because it curves quite a bit, but up to, as close as a couple hundred, up to like a quarter mile, maybe a mile or so, beyond that canal is where the U.S. border actually starts. So there's kind of like this demarcation zone. I'm really curious about that, which is one of the questions we're going to be able to talk to Roy about, and when they come back on here. But we're trying to fix the audio quality because nothing could be more annoying than when you're trying to get that the audio figured out. But you can see right here, you could literally just walk around the wall. Like it's not this isn't a situation where you don't even have to scale the wall here. You can walk right around it. And we weren't able to find anybody as a representative from the Coco, and I might be saying it wrong because we weren't able to talk to anybody from the Cocopah Native Reservation. But what we're hoping to find out is, what happens here, in these situations. Did the wall actually make an impact, or was it the legislation in play, and was it the administration in play rather? And the wall, like I said, you could literally, we've watched people walk up to the wall, walk to the end, and we didn't get a chance to see them walk around it. But they legitimately were just walking up to the wall, and it wasn't like they were, hiding in bushes. They walked up. There was a water station there, and I hope Jeremy and I actually have a clip of that we're going to put up here in a little bit, and we'll get a chance for you guys to see that as well if you didn't catch that in the live feed, because I was actually live when it happened. And in the background there was, 3 Brazilians that walked right up to the wall, and they were like, "Hey, we've been traveling for 3 days." And so yeah, that's just a look at how the wall works. You can see it's wild. So it's wild to think that they're. Annette says it's not even a pretty wall. No surprise there. I don't think they're really going for aesthetics. It's more of a functional use. But they have access to either side of the wall, which is actually, this is important in the development of this wall because, and I'm sure that Roy will be able to talk in greater detail about this, either side of this wall is got access roads now. So they're able to get to places as they've terraformed the land to get the wall put in place up into the mountains. And what he was talking about in one of the earlier feeds that we had a chance to listen to was how a lot of these folks that are hiding from the border patrol in this whole cat and mouse game, they'll find their way up into the arroyos, like these little valleys, and they'll get up into caves up in the hills, up in the mountains, and little ravines. And what this gives access to is more direct support along either side of the wall. So, whether or not it's effective, hopefully he'll be able to give us a better idea of that. And Denise Malloy over on YouTube says, if we want produce, we need these workers, as white people won't work the fields. It's damn backbreaking work. You're not wrong. You're not wrong. The work is hard. And we did talk to a gentleman who's a foreman of one of the fields, and he said that we asked, why aren't there more Americans that come out and do the work, and more güeros like this guy. And he was like, they come out, they don't last. They bail. It's 15 hours a day. It's 110-degree weather. In the South, you guys know right now is having, they've been in the middle of a drought, major heat wave. So, I mean, you're looking at 120 plus degree weather for 15 hours a day. Oh, I see what you see. Okay. So Annette, I'm following you now. I wasn't shaming you. I was just, so it's a matter of, of the necessity of work. We need people. Like I said, an uptick of about 20,000 jobs will be needed in September. Who's going to fill that work? You know what I mean? Like Denise was saying, we need people to do that work, to provide us with all the lush greens that we have at our Whole Foods and whatnot. So it's just a matter of getting people in there. Some of the things that I saw were pretty wild. It's pretty disturbing, actually. I mean, there was more than just. I don't know if you guys saw the picture that I put up with the baby bottle that I found out in the desert there. But even closer, as we were further into the border, as we went out, we found it was a little toy kit. I found it kind of discarded under a bush, and Steve, I appreciate that for sharing that video. Yeah, please guys, share the feed out. Let's go ahead and share it out to as many people as possible out here if we could. And what happened was, I found the toy kit, and when I popped it open, it's not like just a garbage dump area. There's nobody out there. We had to walk for a while to get out to where we were at. And inside this toy kit was, like a little doctor's kit, a stethoscope and, little knee tapper, reflex kit. But there was also a child's face mask, like a little extra pair of like children's underwear was in there. There was a little box of Fruitios, like a snack that was in this toy kit. And it was just basically melting out in the desert underneath in the sun. And it broke my heart, to think that there's children that are out making this voyage. And that's one of the things that we're looking to talk to Roy about is, and it looks like they're coming back into the studio here. So we're going to bring them back on if they're ready to come in. Yes. And then we're going to go ahead and jump back into things here. So somebody confer with my cohort here, my co-host Jeremy. We're good. Got the thumbs up. We're going to bring him back in. Jeremy, welcome back.
Hey, so we just adjusted a couple of sound issues, so he's about to log back in, and we'll be able to proceed without the technical difficulties and static. So
there we go.
What did I miss?
Nothing. I was covering. I showed a picture of the video of the wall that we have on here right now. I just kind of giving people an idea of how effective or ineffective the wall really is, and that's really kind of up to interpretation. And I'm hoping that Roy can shine a light on that for us.
And the question that I'm going to have for him when we get him back is, why is the wall set back? That's what we figured out when we were looking at GPS. The wall itself was set back from the border. That means
that's what I was saying, yeah.
Folks cross on at certain points of the wall, and they're there. Okay, he says he's joining the waiting room right now. So let's.
Okay, I'm going to bring him in right now.
Okay. All right.
Hopefully
Roy,
better.
Back in here.
Yeah.
Oh, we can hear you a lot better. Yeah,
okay, great.
A lot better.
Great.
Let's go ahead and get this picture. Nope, I don't want to hog up all the space here. There, that's better. Okay, that's better. Now we can see everybody in equal share here. So, Roy, while you were gone, I was just touching on some of the questions that we're going to have. Some of the big questions, about the cartel involvement with immigration crisis. Did we refer to it as an immigration crisis? Is it any different right now than it has been historically?
Well, if you look at pure numbers, then the answer is no. But if you look at the demographics for the population, the answer is yes. So the volume of illegal migration at its peak was about 1.5 million people per year that were arrested. That doesn't account for the people that eluded arrest. Right now, the volume is just under 1 million, but what makes this a crisis is the type of population that we're dealing with. A lot of unaccompanied children and families.
Tell us about that.
Absolutely. So when we look at the history of illegal migration, it's traditionally been single adults, principally males of working age, who would come over here, work for 6 months, 8 months, send remittances to the home country, and then after a certain period of time return and then repeat that cycle. In let's see, 2010 or so, we started to see a transition towards whole families coming, as opposed to just dad or mom and dad by themselves. And in 2014, that became the norm. And what makes it a crisis is that the immigration border enforcement system is not designed for the volume of unaccompanied children that we began witnessing in 2014, or the number of family units that are presenting themselves at the border. There isn't any entity in the world, law enforcement entity, that's designed for the detention of families and children, particularly at this level. So what happened in 2014, 2017, 2019, and what's happening right now is that the detention system came to a grinding halt. There was no mechanism for detaining, holding, and caring for the unaccompanied children or the families. And the previous administration and this current administration haven't made any investments or decisions to, I would say, acknowledge the fact that this new demographic is no longer new. It's now the norm. And so we either have to legislate our way out of this, or we have to change the way that we're going to treat these demographics.
Now, real fast, if you walk us through, if you could, what's the process when it comes right down to someone gets detained, apprehended, trying to cross the border illegally, with or without family? If you could give us like both scenarios, like what actually happens in that situation? What do they do?
Absolutely. So anyone who's apprehended at the border, and I'll start with a single adult.
Okay.
The single adult is apprehended at the border. Usually, when I make reference of an apprehension at the border, I'm talking between the ports of entry, because at the port of entry, you can have both legal migration, where you present yourself for entry, and you can have illegal migration. You're smuggled in a vehicle, or you have fraudulent documents. Those that occur between the ports of entry, irrespective of what part of the world you come from, have the same rights. The Border Patrol agent will make a determination as to whether or not the person has a legal right to be in the United States. And more than likely, if you've entered between the ports of entry, out in the desert or mountains, you're entering illegally. That person is then taken into custody. Everyone's fingerprints are captured. They're rolled into a system. And the system is looking for criminal records, both here in the United States and then throughout the world. And so if we identify somebody who's got a warrant or a criminal record that would make them ineligible for legal migration, then they're set up and prosecuted. So there is a criminal element to it. Individuals can be prosecuted for entering illegally or being a particular type of individual with a criminal record. If that person has neither, doesn't have a criminal record, doesn't have any wants or warrants, he or she is presented with two options. You can elect to be voluntarily returned to your home country. In essence, you say, I acknowledge that I've entered the country illegally and I simply want to go back. No harm, no foul, basically. And then that person is removed back to their host country, whether it's Mexico or anywhere else in the United States. If that individual feels that they have a legal recourse to remain in the United States, at that point they're processed for it could be asylum, it could be for the legal migration, and then given an immigration hearing. And this is where it becomes convoluted, because our system, so you go from the border enforcement aspect of it to the judicial part, and it is so backlogged that if I'm arrested today and I ask for an asylum hearing, it's going to be, if I'm fortunate, 3 years, but more likely 5 to 7 years from now before I'm able to truly work my case through the immigration court system.
And they're staying detained in like an ICE facility for 5 to 7 years, 3 to 7 years possibly.
No, not at all. So some individuals, if they have criminal records or they are a threat to the country, they can be detained. So there are some folks who are detained. The majority of individuals may be detained for a short period of time, at which point then they're released. What ICE, ERO, Immigration and Enforcement Operations, what they will do is they look for a sponsor, usually a family member, or it could be a non-government organization or a church group that will sponsor this family, pay for travel to wherever it may be in the United States, Chicago, New York, South Carolina, Ohio. And then they're released by ICRO and given it's basically a set of paperwork that says, hey, you've entered the country illegally, you've asked for asylum, you're being released on these terms, and here's your first hearing date. And it's usually wherever they're traveling to, it's the nearest immigration court. And then at that point, they begin to report on a regular basis. It's kind of like being on parole. In some cases, they're issued just a simple cell phone, and they take a picture and they check in with their ICE agent. In other cases, it can be an ankle bracelet, and then at some point, when you establish a pattern of consistency, then it becomes a 30-day or 90-day check-in at the ICE office.
Wow!
But the whole process can take years, and that's what makes this problematic. Is that when you look at the volume of people coming in, and the fact that it's going to be 3, 5, 7 years before they get a determination on their immigration case, we're adding millions upon millions of people into the system when the system is already backlogged.
Right. Now, what about? Sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
I was going to say there's a viewer question that I think is interesting. You had mentioned that there was a change in demographics that happened around 2014. What do you believe led to that, and what changed either, geopolitically, or what happened? What was here at home? Did something change? What was that? You said around 2014 or so is what you saw.
More or less about 2014. Absolutely. And I wish I could put my finger on the exact cause of it, but when we look at migration, illegal migration, it's complex. There's no singular source behind a lot of what's happening at the border. My personal opinion is that part of what happened was there was a realization that if I come across as a family group, I was going to be released. And one of the things that is a truism of illegal migration is that there is a direct line of communication from me as a family unit that enters the United States, is detained, and then released within 72 hours, back to all my friends and family in my host country. And that word of mouth, particularly today with social media and cell phones, when you look back in the late 90s and early 2000s, our communication wasn't as free-flowing and convenient as it is today. Today, you can communicate with anybody real time, anywhere in the world. So part of it, I think a lot of it is word of mouth. And so what people began to realize is that if I come to the United States as with my kids, with my wife, I'm probably going to be released after a short detention period. And as soon as that began to matriculate within the communities in Central America, and now we're seeing Brazil, Romanians, even Ethiopians. It's become a realization that this is kind of my ticket into being released in the United States. And if you're looking at 3 to 5 years before you even have an immigration hearing, you're okay, because you're going to get your family. There's resources that are available to you. Your kids get to go to school. You're going to work illegally in most cases, but that's part of one of the shortfalls of our immigration system, is that we did the labor or worksite enforcement for a while, and then it just got pushed aside.
Now, you mentioned something. I appreciate you sharing that part. You said something about this family dynamic, and that's something that really it came up earlier when I was listening to one of the other podcasts you had about these children that are being rented, so people can appear like a family unit, and because they know they get that pass. If you come across a nuclear family situation, mom, dad, kid, they're getting released back to the interior, we'll say, of the United States. And then I heard you say that. Walk us through that situation. What is like from where it begins and where it ends? Like what's happened with that?
And CJ, when you the situation with children being rented, or
absolutely.
Okay, and this is a reality of the border, particularly with criminal organizations. We call them transnational criminal organizations, cartels, smugglers, whatever title or label you'd like to apply to them, it's all one and the same. Recognizing that you could utilize a child to affect your release what we saw in 2017 and 2019 is when it really began to grow in volume, was the renting of children. Uh, there were, gosh, I think at last count it was either 3,500 or 3,800 children that we identified that had been rented. In essence, mom in Guatemala or El Salvador said, look, for $1,500, I'm going to lend you my child. And then that child is either transported by bus or flown into Mexico. And then at the border, they're handed off to a complete stranger. Sometimes it's adult male, sometimes it's a female, and sometimes it's a couple. But more often than not, we were seeing an adult male traveling with children that were not his. And it wasn't, and I hate to say this, but it took us a little bit to catch on to it, because normally children or individuals under the age of 14 are not fingerprinted. It's 18 and up, just adults. And when we started to realize the flow of unaccompanied children coming in, the fact that we suspected that some were being recycled or rented, we began to fingerprint the children. And that's when it really came to light that there was it's kind of disgusting when you think about it, but there was an absolute exploitation of these children in that they were being rented, brought in. And then from there, some of these groups were being, or I say groups, some of the children and the people they were with were going into Florida and Chicago and North Carolina, and we worked hand in hand with ICE to follow these traffickers to locations, and then we would show up, and in some cases we were able to recover the kids. In other cases, it had already been flown back into Mexico or to Guatemala to repeat this process. So these particular smuggling organizations, once we began to break them up, word in that community gets out, but it hasn't gone away. It continues.
How prominent is this when you look at the whole picture of immigration? In other words, did you say a number about 3,000 or something? Or you said that a certain number of kids you were able to identify had been in this situation where essentially
recycled.
They would have been exploited.
Recycled or rented. It was about 3,500 to 3,800 children.
Okay.
So
is that a month of the year? Is that when is
that was during the time frame when we first took note of it and really began to capture, and I use the term capture, but when we really began to understand what the situation at hand was. And then when we began to capture fingerprints is when we really started to realize the extent of it. So we began to, and our agents are trained, but part of the problem that we were realizing was because of the volume of families and unaccompanied children coming into our custody, you don't have the time to focus on the small nuances that are going to tip you off to the fact that this individual is probably not dad or related to these children.
Is there a threat there, would you say?
Absolutely.
The children are afraid to say, no, he's not my dad. Or do they understand, some of them, that what their role is, for lack of a better term, in this recycled, situation?
For some of these kids, there was an understanding of, I'm going along with this guy. That's kind of my role or my job. Some of them were very young. We had one instance where it was a baby that was 6 months old. And it was only because an agent was paying attention and noticed that here's this young man who has a 6-month-old. He's not concerned about why the baby's crying, hasn't changed a diaper, hasn't asked for baby food. And then at one point sets the baby down on a bench. And if you've had kids, you don't sit a 6-month-old on a bench and just walk away.
They might start smoking or something. You don't want that. Can't leave them unattended for a minute.
Exactly. But the agent noticed this and then walked over, and then through some conversation and debriefing, got this young man to admit, yeah, I rented this kid. I don't know who it belongs to. I rented it because I know that I would be in custody with you for a short period of time, and you're going to release me. So is there a threat? There's a threat of harm. There's a threat of negligence. There's a threat of trafficking, maybe sexual exploitation. Absolutely. These are very vulnerable kids.
Yeah. What happens? I mean, we've got I heard a statistic that I think it was in April. They said something along the lines of like 20,000 unaccompanied minors were hitting the southern border. And in these situations where there's the ambiguity of their travel and the undefined nature of where they're going, where they came from, who they're with. What are we doing in the border to help? How are they housed? I mean, I'm very curious about this. Like, what do we do in these situations? Because you've seen these kids in cages. You hear that term, and that they're jailing kids at the border is what people are saying. But from what you're saying, it sounds like they're just overrun. I mean, what do you do? What's going on?
Well, and that's the situation. That's the reality of it. As I mentioned earlier, there isn't a singular law enforcement entity that's designed to house or detain families and children. At least not as it relates to enforcement operations, right? Your local PD isn't housing families; they're not housing hundreds, or in our case, tens of thousands of children. So what happened was it's simply that the volume of unaccompanied children that were arriving at the southwest border, that were coming across the border and looking for the border patrol, just overwhelmed the capabilities of the border patrol, and then overwhelmed the capabilities of the entire immigration system. And as a parent, when I was the chief and I'd walk back into some of our stations and our detention areas, it breaks my heart. It broke my heart to look at these little kids sitting in a jail cell, and that's exactly what it is. When we look at the cages, as they were alluded to, part of that was what was put up was in response to the volume of illegal migration that the Border Patrol is witnessing. Everything for the Border Patrol is temporary in nature. The detention cells, whether they're permanent fixed structures, concrete walls, or chain link fencing, it's designed for temporary detention because the flow traditionally with single adults was they were in and out of custody usually within 48 hours, if not less. When that demographic changed to families and children, that flow, the norm, completely ceased. And now we were found in this situation where the Border Patrol is having to hold on to and house children and families because the rest of the immigration enforcement system didn't have the capability or the capacity to take them out of the hands of the Border Patrol. One of the things is we could arrest all day long, but we'd never arrest ourselves out of that problem because the problem was beyond the Border Patrol. It was about ORR and HHS having the facilities to take the families and house them, take the children and house them. And that's a continuing problem today.
So in that situation, and one of our viewers is asking, if a child is recognized as an exploited child, do we keep them in the U.S. While we figure out what to do with them, or is there try to backlog and figure out where they came from and find their family in their country of origin? And what is happening? Well, that'll be the first one. There's a 2-part question here. So
sure. So a lot of times from the aspect of, I'll hit it on 2 fronts: unaccompanied children, and then when we discover someone's being trafficked or rented. So if someone's being trafficked or rented, we do everything within our power to try to unite them with their family. And it starts from the simplest of things. You're looking for any sort of identification on that child. Is there a phone number in the pocket, in the backpack, on his toys? Is there something that you can use to begin to track back to where this child came from? And then you debrief or interview the person that they're traveling with to see if you can figure out, where did they pick the child up at? How do they contact the smuggler who gave them the child? What information do you have for that smuggler? And we worked hand in hand with both ICE and the consuls of those countries. The consuls do a tremendous job for us also because they have the ability to reach back into Mexico where some of these and I said I'm talking about the criminals, some of these criminal organizations are at, and use resources to sometimes identify or track the family back. You also have family members in the home country, Guatemala, El Salvador, wherever it may be, that at some point they go to the consul and say, hey, I rented my child to this person. I haven't seen my child in 6 months. Can you help me? So, I mean, it's, as I mentioned earlier, the complexity of this it's just so immense that it involves so many different aspects from the consuls, from ICE, from non-government organizations. We also work with church groups, faith-based groups, non-government organizations, because sometimes they have the ability to have conversations with people that we don't, and they can help you identify where the child may have come from. So the other question was, what do we do once we identify them? If that child is identified as having been trafficked, they're not. We work towards trying to unite them with their family, or finding someone who is a family member here in the United States. So if we find a phone number for somewhere in New York, we're going to call that number and see what the relationship is. If perchance the consul identifies a family member in the United States, then that child will be reunited once we verify that truly is a family member, reunited with the family member and released from custody. And then
are there paternity test type things that are done? Do you ever go that far with it?
No, and that's one of the weaknesses of this. Um, and my heavy sigh is because that's one of the things that bothers me too, is because the the politicalization of this, the images of children's detention cell or being housed and the thought of them not being with mom and dad or with their family members is it's a concept. It's a negative image. And so the push when it comes to politics to remove that image is to get them in and out of our custody, our being the U.S. government's custody, as quickly as possible. So sometimes, and we do our due diligence, we're talking to whether it's the uncle or the aunt or sometimes grandma or grandpa that are in the U.S. And we do everything we can to see if we can talk to mom or dad back in Guatemala or El Salvador, so that there is some sort of verification, albeit weak. It is some sort of verification. Would I prefer that we take the extra step of a test or some sort of validation? Absolutely, but it's not happening right now.
Man.
Jeremy, what was it that exactly happened where kids in cages became essentially a viral headline, a mass media point, where whether it was images from a specific detention center, when you look back on it, are you able to shed some light to us as to what was true and what wasn't, how widespread was the images? Was it an isolated incident? I don't know, because everything, as you say, is politicized in such and weaponized at that matter by different sides. What was the real story there? What happened? Are you able to walk us through that a little bit?
What is it? A picture says 1,000 words, and depending upon who the author is, those 1,000 words can paint it positively or negatively. The reality, again, is that the volume of unaccompanied children and families that were showing up at the border just overwhelmed Border Patrol capability. And it was principally down in South Texas, in Rio Grande Valley. The stations there, all of them are designed to house a certain amount of detainees, and they were simply overwhelmed. And so if you catch 500 people or 500 people self-surrender and then you bring them into custody, and this is happening every day, the throughput or the output in this case has to match it with HHS or Office of Refugee and Resettlement, and they didn't have that capability. There simply weren't enough resources for the output to take place. So you have this constant flow every day of new migrants, asylum seekers coming into the custody of the Border Patrol with a very limited ability to push them out of the stations. It's kind of like it's the proverbial drinking out of a straw. We're sticking it into this milkshake, but instead of having a straw that's big enough to actually suck that milkshake up, you're dealing with a very small straw that just doesn't work. And so that backlog started to build and build and build. And one of the things that the Border Patrol was doing was relaying this information up through its chain of command, up to headquarters, to our elected officials, saying, "Hey, we need to do something. This needs to get fixed." And then, of course, once the images got released, as you said, it got politicized or weaponized, and we were stuck with kids in cages.
Now, we saw images where kids were being brought to different hotels. There was, how, and again, like you said, a picture can, depending on what angle it's taken from and how you see it, can tell a different story. But when you have, like you said, 500 new unaccompanied minors a day, and the process can go through, from what we talked to with another gentleman, he said that there's 72 hours currently is basically the flip over time, because of how much they're trying to process is about how long they're detained or held. But with these kids, where do they go? What do you do? You've got that much of an influx. What's the next step?
And that's the issue: is children should be in in the Border Patrol's custody less than 72 hours. When you don't have the ability to take them out of the Border Patrol custody and put them into the proper authorities' hands, that's when you get that buildup. And I use the number of 500, but at one point, and this was right before I retired, we had something like 7,800 unaccompanied children in custody on a singular day.
How long have they been in custody? Was that just from one day, or
no?
Have they been in there for a while? That was an accumulation of.
And it's accumulation. What we were witnessing, and I can speak to what I witnessed here in Tucson. It was on any given day, it could be as few as 50 and upwards of 300. So from day to day, it just varied, and that's just one sector. The Border Patrol has 9 sectors or 9 geographical areas that are along the southwest border. The areas that we were seeing the highest volume of unaccompanied children were in South Texas and Rio Grande, El Paso, Tucson, and San Diego. And just those 4 locations in and of themselves were accounting for, again, as they started to add up, 2,000, 5,000, 8,000 children. And with the lack of ability, i.e., detention, and I shouldn't use detention, but it is a form of detention, but proper housing for these unaccompanied children. That's the reason you saw this volume of children sitting in Border Patrol facilities.
Right.
You mentioned the hotels. It's not a new concept, but it's something that's been renovated and it's being utilized today as we speak. In that the administration is renting out hotels, has created larger facilities for unaccompanied children, but hotels for families. So when they come into Border Patrol custody, they're processed and then as quickly as possible removed from the Border Patrol custody into the hands of ICRO and then placed into hotels so that they can complete the processing, and then these families then do their onward trip to wherever they may be going.
Do they have a certain I don't know the proper term here. I'm going to say like a shelf life or whatever they want to say. Well, they're in the hotel and they're like, hey, they've been here for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, a year. Like, we just need to figure out what country they're from and then send them back, or what do you do?
A much shorter shelf life. Actually, it's the same concept. The government's effort is to have them in and out of those hotels or shelters within 72 hours. So if you think back to the Trump administration, when we talked, he talked about the catch and release. The problem with catch and release is that it invites continued illegal migration. There isn't a deterrent. It doesn't stop it. And there isn't a legal mechanism to address it. So you find yourself in this constant cycle of every day more and more people showing up, entering the country illegally, and then being released. And then word of mouth filters back to their towns, their cities, their families. And this perpetual flow of illegal migration just continues. Well, we moved from catch and release to catch or detain, and or remain in Mexico under the Trump administration, which served as a deterrent. The intent was to break that cycle, and now under the Biden administration, we're back to catch and release. The difference is we're removing them from Border Patrol custody, putting them into ICE ERO custody, and then releasing them into the United States as quickly as possible. But you're not seeing that same backlog that we witnessed a year ago or 2 years ago with the kids in cages or Border Patrol facilities being overrun.
Yeah. Now, Susan Meek, one of our YouTube followers here, says that they're being bussed and flown all over the U.S. and then followed that up with on the taxpayers' dime. Some of the questions that we've had and some of the concerns that people have voiced were the amazing amount of money that's being spent on the wall, just even in Arizona. I can't remember the dollar amount, Jeremy. Do you remember per mile? It was something like 13 million per mile of border wall in Arizona.
I don't remember offhand, but that what you just brought up, as far as, is that true that where they go next, that they're bussed at the expense of the taxpayer? Is that inaccurate? I just want to check first on that comment. Is that an accurate description?
It is accurate. So as long as they are in the detention or the care of the U.S. government, everything that's provided to them or that is done with them is at the expense of the U.S. government or taxpayer funding. So if they are bussed from the border to a hotel or flown from one part of the country to another part to be processed, that comes at the expense of the U.S. government.
And now we just talked about the major expense, of course, that CJ just mentioned that dominates the headlines is the wall. And how has that worked or not worked in your opinion? One thing that we observed on our GPS, where we were not far from Yuma, that the wall was set back from the border. So the wall, people actually were arriving across the border according to our GPS, and then arriving later at the wall, but already on American soil. Can you explain the logic behind that and how the wall works or does not work?
Okay. So let me start with the wall and the principle behind the wall. What gets lost in the rhetoric of the wall is that everybody focuses on a singular aspect, the wall.
The wall. Yeah.
Um, but what it is, it's actually a border enforcement system. It's the border wall itself. And what's critical is that if border patrol agents get to the border, they can't enforce the border. So with the border wall comes infrastructure, access roads. Um, so you get the border wall, you get the access roads, you also get power, you get technology that goes into place. So this entire system is why it's, as you mentioned, I think 13 mile, maybe it's 13 million per mile. I forget the exact figure. It's now that I've removed myself, it doesn't stick freshly in my mind, but it's in the millions per mile. But it's because what it's doing is it's providing the border patrol agents access to the border itself. It's putting up a demarcation. It's implementing or introducing new technology. So it's this whole comprehensive border enforcement system that we should be talking about. But again, it's been politicized, so we focus on one thing. And so, does wall work? And you mentioned Yuma. I was in Yuma in 2004. 2004, we witnessed 2,800 vehicle drive-throughs. These were vehicles that were loaded with either narcotics or people that drove right across the border. The Yuma became the focal point of illegal migration in 2004. And from 2004 to about 2006, this was the one and only time in my career that I saw a plan come to fruition and work effectively. In that we looked at three things: the infrastructure, which is the border wall, the border roads, the addition of technology, and the addition of manpower. And in the span of about a year, maybe a year and a half, we were able to bring that segment of border under control. So what had been sort of like the wild, wild west of vehicles driving across and the other thing too is where you have illegal migration that's out of control, you have a high degree of border violence. And we were able to quell that with bringing these three elements: technology, border infrastructure, and manpower into play in about a year. And we brought that under control. So can border wall work, or can border enforcement systems work? Absolutely. And I saw the same thing in San Diego. When I first got there in 1988, it was completely out of control. There was no demarcation along the border. There were strands of barbed wire or nothing at all.
Mm-hmm.
So when you put up a wall, it serves multiple purposes. It demarcates the border. It sort of shapes the environment in which border enforcement takes place. So if I can shift that flow of illegal migration into an area that I can control or better enforce, it works for me. Now I can either employ technology in other locations, and I can also, and again, even though it sounds like a lot at 20,000 agents, again, it's the entire United States. And so at any given time, as an example, in Tucson sector, I may have 300 to 400 people working, and that's 260 miles of just border itself, with tens of thousands of miles square miles behind it, where people were being smuggled, or narcotic traffickers were bringing in illegal narcotics. So, does it work? Yes. Does it have shortfalls? Yes. There is nothing that is impregnable. Can it be scaled? Can it be cut? Can it be dug under? With time and effort, absolutely. But the change in what we have today is traditional fencing was 10 feet, maybe 14 feet at the most. There wasn't a foundational base beneath it. So you had a lot of tunneling or burrowing underneath the fence. You had fencing that was easily cut through and easily scaled. So the new model that's been implemented, and I think that's what you have up there, is it's 30 feet in height. And when you look at 30 feet, it's impressive. The first time I saw it, I was taken aback by just how high 30 feet is. So now you've really relegated the type of person that can scale or climb that fence or get over it to a certain demographic.
But in this situation, if you look as it continues, though, this is over in Yuma, kind of in between the San Luis and the Los Algodones border. The wall ends right there, and that's Mexico we're looking at. You could literally just walk right around the wall. This is one of the native reservations, or the Cocopa. I might be saying it wrong. Native reservation, and they said that one of the border patrol agents said it's a pretty hot point for people to cross over. But this blew our mind based off of what we saw with current administration, with the whole catch and release situation, and the fact that people could literally just walk up to the border and walk across it. That it does show it's standing as a sign of, of the wall. It's giving you an idea of the perimeter in which we operate as a nation. But we're seeing that people now are bold that there's no need for them to even. They don't worry about the border patrol agents. They said they seek them out now. Is that something you saw, or that people are now it's at a point where they know they're going to go ahead and get a free pass, so there's no need for them to run and hide, dig, climb, put themselves in harm's way in order to get across the border when they can easily just walk across it.
Yeah, and that's part of the change that we witnessed. So you still have the those that are seeking to enter illegally and elude apprehension. Those individuals are going to cross wherever it is that they decide to go, and they will do everything in their power to elude arrest, whether it's wearing carpet booties, camouflage, whatever tactics they employ. Their intent is to elude arrest at all costs. And then you have families and unaccompanied children that will simply self-surrender. What becomes problematic is it's the care and well-being that's placed into that demographic. At one point in Tucson, I had about 40, maybe 50% of my workforce dedicated to just caring for the migrants we had in the city. The caring includes the feeding, the welfare checks, the going to the hospital, the processing so that you can release them to ICE, and then eventually their onward journeys. That took a tremendous amount of personnel. So when you take 40% or even 50% of your workforce, your border security workforce, away from doing their mission, which is border security, now you have whole segments of the border that are wide open. And one of the things that I often mention is the fact that the cartels, they recognize this and they exploit this. In Tucson, one of the things that we were witnessing were they were renting charter buses, driving them, because on the Mexican side of the border, there's a freeway that virtually parallels our border. Whereas on the U.S. side, you have a lot of wide open desert that's unincorporated, not urbanized. And so they would charter these buses filled with families and kids. They'd drive out to the desert. And again, not every segment of the border is fenced off, just as you articulated. And then they would usher the families and the kids across the border and tell them to wait, because they knew that a ground sensor or a camera or a UAS up in the sky was going to spot this large group of people. And then it became problematic, because if there's no wall there, that means there's no infrastructure to get to them. So now you have to use 4x4s to go into this desert, and then slowly extract every person away from the desert to an area where you can provide care, load them up into a van or a bus and get them to a station. A group of 300 would take us 48 to 72 hours to get them out of the desert, and so in the interim, you're taking water, you're taking food, you're taking shade structures, and so your whole focus becomes the welfare and safety of these people, and at the cost of border security.
It's coming like a rescue mission almost at that point, because
Absolutely.
you got young
Absolutely.
people; they're not going to make it out in the elements. Old folks,
Yeah, and what's often misunderstood is in the desert during the winter, it's extremely cold out there. So there's the aspect of winter temperatures. During the day, it could be 60, 70 degrees, and at night it drops down to the low 30s, maybe even high 20s. In the summer, this past week, it's been 115 to 120 here in the desert. So yeah, it absolutely becomes a critical rescue mission, because the last thing you want to do is have these folks who are within your grasp succumbing to the elements.
We were
Now-
we were over. We have some video of the Mexico side. We had gone through from Los Algodones. We had gone south and then walked through the desert here, and it is harsh conditions, and it was hot. We didn't obviously go all the way, but we just having GPS and the advent of technology. You mentioned 2014 and the changes. We were able to look on a smartphone and sort of see how far we were away from the wall as we walked through these very harsh conditions. But the question sort of arises that we didn't see any border or authorities here as we walk through the Mexico side. Is there cooperation, and what can be done in coordination with authorities in Mexico? Because what we noticed, we didn't see. CJ, did you see any authorities as we were kind of walking around on this trek here?
No, we saw onion farmers. That was it.
Yeah, we did.
No,
we saw.
that was it.
We saw
And they were,
farmers.
and even they were confused by what we were doing out there. So they didn't say anything, but they were confused.
Yeah. So to answer your question, there is little to no border enforcement on the Mexican side. When you look at the Mexican Constitution, I think it's Article, oh man, I forget now, Article 2 or Article 14, I forget which one it is, but the free movement of Mexican nationals is within their Constitution. So, as their focus for the longest time on border security has really been about the smugglers and the border violence, not so much on preventing Mexican nationals from migrating into the U.S. Now, as the demographic has changed, and now Mexico is realizing this higher flow of Central Americans and Brazilians, Venezuelans, and Ethiopians, and I mean, you name it. Now they're beginning to focus a little bit more on border security, but they don't have the apparatus that's built for it. They don't have a dedicated border enforcement entity. So when you go to the Mexican border, you may run into Grupo, which is really designed as a search and rescue team, and it's not very well funded. It's not very well equipped. In 2001, I led the effort it was known as a border security initiative. And part of our effort was helping the Mexican government develop their ability to perform search and rescues on the Mexican side of the border. So we worked with the State Department to provide training, to provide equipment. But so from 2001 to 2020 to 2021, you're not going to see a sizable Mexican law enforcement presence doing border enforcement or doing anything to really deter any form of illegal migration. The other aspect is the Mexican military has been brought into this situation, not so much for the illegal migration, but more for the narcotic flow. And I mean, that changed the dynamics also for us in that we went from working with Grupo Beta and there is law enforcement on the Mexican side, that there are those that try to make inroads towards deterring illegal migration, because with illegal migration comes a whole myriad of other crimes: auto theft, trafficking, abuse, narcotics, prostitution, rape, murder.
Right.
I mean, you name it, it's all there. So, I mean, there are Mexican enforcement efforts that take place, but it's really not geared towards stopping or deterring illegal migration.
Let me ask you, how much of it is a cash game? Sorry, I got to know, because a lot of people have been asking on that side of the border. I mean, how much of that just kind of comes down to just they're taking money and it's almost more of a business transaction on that side, and they just leave us to deal with the runoff of everything that happens thereafter?
So when you say the business transaction, you're talking about the
Bribes, things of that
the
nature.
illicit part? Yeah.
Yeah.
Smuggling, it's a multi-billion-dollar industry. A Mexican national is going to pay minimally $3,000 and sometimes upwards of $8,000, depending upon what their smuggling arrangements are. A Central American is going to pay between 10 and 20,000 at the most. An Indian national, someone from the Middle East, is going to pay upwards of 30 to 40,000. Chinese nationals are about 50,000, and then somebody who, and the one thing about this, the smuggling organizations, is they're also cognizant of risk. So if they encounter somebody who they think has terrorist ties or is a really bad person, they're going to charge $50,000, $60,000, $70,000. So when you look at the flow of people coming across the border, 800,000 to $1 million plus, that's a lot of money. It's a lot of money.
Yeah.
And so does corruption exist on the border? Absolutely. One of the things that I witnessed, I mentioned that I worked in Mexico City for some time, and I befriended somebody who worked for the Mexican government, what would be their version of the CIA at the time, was CSEN. He was number 3 in that organization, and he and I developed a very robust friendship. And when I was down in Yuma, I actually asked him to come down because, again, back in 2004, it was completely out of control. And he brought down a vetted unit of folks that he trusted, and they were there for about 72 hours. And at the end of it, he and I, we had an official meeting. He came in and he presented dossiers on all the Mexican leadership and officials in Mexico. And everyone that I had been working with for well over a year now was on the take.
Did that blow your mind, or were you kind of?
Oh, I mean, you suspect it, and you learn
Right.
to recognize that, I'm dealing with somebody who may be on the take, who may be corrupt, but when you have it presented and you're looking at a dossier and it's got bank transactions and you have someone who's an authority figure in the the clandestine industry in Mexico, saying, here's this chief, he's getting $5,000 a week. Here's this person who's getting $10,000 a month. It really blows your mind, because now I'm stuck with having to work with these individuals, but I know at the same time they're corrupt.
What do you do? I mean, do you just like give them that call and say, "Hey, Frank, we're not getting coffee anymore"? Or like, how does that go?
So, the relationship is always going to be somewhat strained, but it certainly changes dramatically when you realize, or it's put right in front of you. When you go from suspicion to validation, yeah, your relationship changes automatically. And the other thing too is it's a needed relationship, because you also need them to help control some of what's happening. They may be working for the CJ cartel, and so they're going to take actions against the Jeremy cartel.
Right.
And so you kind of exploit that, but at the entire time you recognize that this person is on the take, and part of it is cultural in Mexico. The lack of I'm trying to find the right words to describe this, but here in the U.S. we've got a very structured system. Morality, ethics come into play, professionalism, and there's an expectation that if you are wearing a badge, or you're part of the judicial system or the law enforcement community, that you're above reproach. In Mexico, they haven't been able to break that cultural norm of being on the take. One was the pay. The pay was horrible, or probably continues to be horrible for Mexican law enforcement. But the bigger part is just the everyday threat. When you have a cartel that's making billions of dollars, has access to weapons, and approaches you and says, "Hey, I'm doing you a favor of paying you $5,000, and you're going to help me out, or I'm going to kill you."
What's that term? It's gold or
silver. It's el plomo o plata, the silver or lead. Silver or lead. Yeah.
Right. So a lot of them are taking bribes, and they have no choice. They're like, "Hey, we're going to kill you and your family, or we're going to give you $10,000 a month to look the other way."
Yeah. And sometimes that bribery may last for a prolonged period of time, and at some point it gets cut off, and now that officer becomes an indentured. It's like an indentured servitude situation to the cartel. And my friend, it was about a year and a half later, was actually assassinated in Mexico City. And not that
I'm sorry to hear that. That's crazy.
Yeah, it was horrendous. Not that he was on the take, but he took such a proactive effort at going after corrupt officials, at going into border towns and trying to help clean it up, that they eventually assassinated him. And so it's
just got to be a dangerous job. I mean, in a situation where there's lawlessness, and tell us a little bit of this. And this is one of the things that I'm really curious about. And this is we spend a lot of time talking about the border north. Now the border south, like the cartels. I know you have plaza bosses. You got situations where there's these coyotes are getting paid tons of money. You have money handlers. You got people that are trying to get them from different stages across different borders, different country borders, to get them to this border. I mean, so what I'm curious, moving back, if we're looking south from the border, looking back over at Mexico, but what's the crime like? What's the cartel's involvement? How much of an organized crime influence is really existing on the other side of the border that the common American doesn't know about?
And that's a great descriptor. It's organized crime. It is. The cartel has absolute power in Mexico. Let me think here. One of the sons of a cartel leader was arrested, and within hours, he unleashed his cartel on the city. This is down in Sinaloa, and it was kind of reminiscent. If you've watched Black Hawk Down, it was kind of reminiscent of that, in that they were burning tires, controlling intersections. They had people on the back of trucks with large caliber weapons, and they took over the city in the matter of hours. And it was a simple demand: release my son, or we're going to escalate this. And
wow,
the Mexican government, they yielded. They flinched and they released his son. But it was a clear demonstration, and this is within the last 2 years. It was a clear demonstration of the absolute power that the cartels have in Mexico.
Yeah.
But you describe the smuggling apparatus. It's a business. It's a multi-billion-dollar business. You've got You've got folks that handle the finances. You've got folks that do the recruiting, the transportation, the logistics, your smugglers, your guides, and that, on the Mexican side. And then you've got the secondary part of it, which is in the U.S. side. And you replicate that from your transporters, your stash house personnel, your transport, your collectors, the financing. It is a multi-billion-dollar corporation that operates seamlessly across the border.
Let's say this. Let's say I'm in one of these. I don't know how the term you use. I don't want to say. You know what? I end up putting my foot in my mouth all the time, so I'm going to say anyway. A country that might have ties to terrorist organizations. Let's say there's somebody that's trying to come in under that banner, or someone that's got some really bad Interpol heat, something along those lines. A bad guy. How does that process go from start to end? They come up with the money. I mean, they Google it, like, hey, I need a coyote, because I know you can find them on Facebook now. They have actual places where you can search and
Yeah.
just like, hey, I need to smuggle across. I need to smuggle myself across the border. Can someone help me out? I'm like, yeah, a bidding war for that. But let's say I'm in a country, other side of the planet, and I want to get into America. Um, how does that work? Like, what are the steps they take?
Yeah. Well, someone who's who's got terrorist ties or is on Interpol more than likely has the resources and the connections that are going to get him or her to the U.S. border. So it's not so much that they're Googling. They probably got the connect. If you got terrorist ties, you've got the connections, and you're going to get to the border.
Let's say you don't.
And if you don't, and this is, and I wrote myself a note here because you raised what has become a perplexing situation for border enforcement and for the U.S. government. Social media and technology has evolved so quickly that our laws and our enforcement tools are so far behind. And I'm going to date myself here because, I grew up in the era of the Flintstones. We were using manual typewriters and index cards with people's fingerprints and pictures on them. And when I left the Border Patrol, we were in the Jetson era using modern technology. But as it relates to social media, the U.S. government, particularly in the realm of border enforcement, is back in the Flintstone era. We don't have the capabilities to investigate and scout social media. We also have, there are barriers that are put up by the social media corporations, which impede us from doing investigations on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and stuff of that nature. So what happens a lot today is a lot of the recruitment and the research for smugglers is happening on social media, whether it's through Facebook, whether it's on Instagram, you name it. Somebody is posting saying, hey, I'll pay you $1,000 if you're willing to do this. And, on the flip side, I'm willing to smuggle you or arrange your smuggling arrangements. Contact me. And it's that simple with social media today.
But I mean, you were talking up in 30, 40, 50. I even heard on another cast that you were doing that. Some people are paying up in $80,000 to get across into the United States. And does that cover your airfare and meals? I mean, is there a per diem? How does that work? I mean, it's just that money goes somewhere, and someone has to say, "All right, I got you. I'm going to take care of you." Granted, I'm as crooked as they come, but I'm going to take care of your money and get you across the border safely. Or do they even care? Like, how does that work?
This individual who wants to be smuggled is a simple commodity. I'm an individual or a person. I'm a commodity. I'm a number. I'm a widget that gets picked up here and transported here. That's all it is. And we talked about social media, but the other thing is just simply word of mouth and smuggling organizations that are so well entrenched that, for example, in India, actually, India is a great example when I think about it. You can look on the newspaper, and the newspapers they're in India, and they have advertisements. A lot of it's under the pretext of tourism. Will arrange your trip to the United States, but it's outright smuggling. So a lot of folks through word of mouth, Roy does it. And then I'm telling CJ, hey, if you go to Jeremy's World Travel Organization, they're going to get you to the US. And that's how a lot of it happens. But it is blatantly projected out in the open in a lot of these countries. And we don't have the reach to go back there and put an end to it. So. Yeah.
So you're just like, you're dealing with it, stemming it at the wall. Like, you're literally like trying to plug the dam where the water slows, and try to slow the flow because
Yeah.
I mean, it sounds like I said, it's just such a nebulous of things happening on the other side to get people just to that point where you just have to focus on when they get to the line. This is America. This is Mexico. Let's get them over here. Let's not let them in. What are we going to do? But and
Yeah.
they're coming from all over the world. I mean,
Oh,
right? And you got,
absolutely.
where would you say the
Absolutely.
largest percentage of our immigration is coming from? The illegal
Right
aliens.
now, a large percentage is coming from Brazil, Brazil, Venezuela, India, and a lot of Romanians right now is what I'm through conversations that I'm having. That's what's being reported to me. But
They're
Brazil right
known
now is number
travelers. They
one.
love to get out there. The Romanians love to get out there and travel. So,
Yeah,
we
you know,
actually
and
encountered 3 Brazilians while we were down in Yuma. That while we were standing there doing a live feed, I was kind of looking across the border, and 3 bodies popped up. And there was a water station, which I thought was really odd. They had 3 big coolers that were set up, and I saw them kind of dump out what they had in their water bottles and refill it at this water station. Jeremy, you want to chime in on that one?
Yeah, on the other side, important to note, the water station, we were looking at the water station. We're on the American side of the border, and we're looking through the poles, and we can see the water station on the what we thought was the Mexico side, but in fact, when we looked at the GPS, the border was set back another mile or a couple football fields. Can you tell us a little bit about what we saw and why would that be that there's a water station right there and that the border itself was, a couple football fields away, that they were all the people we were talking to. And I think we have a clip of it.
You do. It's not in here right now, or is it?
I
It
think
is
I
in here,
just put
actually.
it
It's
right here.
Yeah.
Yeah. And we could just roll a little of it.
Yeah. I'll go ahead and add
Program
that
and
in the
structure
stream here.
set up, then you can dedicate.
But at this point, just so you know, Roy, we were both doing our own thing, and I saw the bodies pop up, and here I can give you a little bit of audio here.
So CJ's calling out to them
So-
here.
He's asking, so CJ's.
That
Hola.
does speak Spanish. So
They speak-
that's what was
Hey.
interesting is they. So Jeremy, just saying real fast. So I asked if they spoke Spanish, and they said only a little bit, and you could tell they had an accent. So I asked if they spoke Portuguese, and of course they did come up. And then luckily Jeremy here is a talented man because he was able to pull us through this. But
Eu falo pouco português. De onde é você?
I was impressed that they were willing to respond to us.
De onde
Yeah.
é você? Brasil? Oh,
there were 3 of them.
Brasil. So there's that's interesting. There's some Brazilians on the other side of the wall right there that we're talking to. Quanto tempo está viajando? What? Yeah. Quantos dias está viajando? 3 dias? Okay.
I was impressed that they were willing.
Yeah,
You
I
could
just
see them
asked it.
right there, their
yeah,
silhouettes.
you can see that right there. Yeah,
But they seem to be, 3 youngsters, maybe early 20s or late teens, very young.
youngsters.
Youngsters.
That
yeah.
makes you sound like you're 80, Jeremy. I'm just going to say it. These young kids were walking around with their skipping ropes and their hula hoops.
Yeah, they seemed young. They were willing to talk to us, which I thought was surprising. But what I didn't realize when I made this point earlier when I looked at the GPS. Now they have just left the water station there, and he just asked me to ask them if they were okay and so forth. But they're already in the United States because the border
and
is
mind
set
you,
back. Now why
They're
is
heading
that?
towards that open wall too. Remember
Yeah.
that, Jeremy? They're about probably from the earlier video that we showed. They're probably about, I don't know, what would you say, about a mile and a half,
Mile
Jeremy?
and a half, yeah, from the open part. So once they get to
yeah.
the end, they'll just be able to hang a right. Now, every time CJ and I showed up, Border Patrol was on us pretty quickly while we
Right
were
away.
there filming. Right away. Eventually, I think they got used to us and they stopped showing up when we'd show up. But I could imagine that once they got to the end, they would have been there would have been an encounter there. But why is that? Why is a water station there and the wall itself set back from the actual border?
So when you look at the border wall, most of the border wall is set back anywhere from. And I'll have to discuss it in various aspects of it. But when it's at the immediate border, there's usually a setback of 3 to maybe 10 feet, because the one of the things that we have to have the ability to do is to do wall or fence maintenance.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's on the immediate border and then we have to fix it from the south side, now we're standing in Mexico and now we're violating, their sovereignty. So usually the fence, when you get to the fence and you're thinking, oh, here's the international border, probably another 3 to 7 feet back is where the actual border is, because what we'll do is we'll open up a gate, we'll go in there, and then we'll repair the fence where we have to. There are areas where, because of the topography, we simply can't get to the immediate border. And so you'll see where the fence either moves north into the U.S. away from the border. And again, it's about where can we put it up? How do we shape that flow of migration? And one of the aspects that I also failed to mention is environmental, the environment itself. There are certain, there are environmental issues that we have to contend with. When I first came with the Border Patrol, I never thought that I'd be dealing with environmental assessments or endangered species or water flows. And, when I retired, that became a part of my vernacular. We were having conversations about, hey, if we're going to put up a wall on this particular occasion, have we done X, Y, and Z related to, environmental protection stuff? And so sometimes you'll see a setback because there may have been something that was identified as an endangered species, a spotted owl, or
right.
And there's also, you mentioned that the Kokopah. Along the border itself, and in various areas along the border, there are native tribes there. And so we have to be cognizant of their cultural sensitivity. There are sacred sites there. And so we either try to mitigate it so that we're not desecrating or disturbing the area, or we try to build around it.
Let me ask you a question, just real fast, and I want to continue on the line that you're on. And if you're not allowed to dig too deep into this, or if you don't feel comfortable with it, feel free. I was having a conversation with a gentleman, and who's a native, not from Arizona. He's from Texas, but he was saying that there's money exchanging hands in all places, and he said that. And I was asking, well, why do you think they didn't allow them, or do you think that the native tribe didn't allow them to build the wall across the Kokopah, section of land? Because it does go from both sides of the border. It extends. And he kind of shrugged it off, and he was like, well, I mean, there's many reasons why somebody wouldn't want a wall there. I mean, it could have been a cultural thing, like you're saying. And he said it could have been too that, there was an arrangement made on the other side where they were like, hey, we need a place where we can put people through, and we're willing to pay you X amount of dollars to allow us to do that. We just need you to go ahead and tell the U.S. they're not allowed to build a fence in this area. And it's kind of, I don't know, it seemed like a little far-fetched, but I mean, is there any validity to something along those lines?
So one of the things that I witnessed, so we have to recognize that, as an example, the Kokopah or the Tohono Nation, they are sovereign nations and they view themselves as such. Whenever we had interactions or meetings, it was done on behalf of that native nation, and it was the native nation to the United States. And albeit, at the end of the day, when we had a conversation, we're all U.S. citizens, it's still this mindset of it's our sovereign nation and we'll dictate what's going to happen here. Culturally, I mean, a big part of and what I witnessed is it really it redounds upon the fact that they're concerned about desecrating burial sites, sacred locations, and in some cases, I mean, and I don't want to paint the picture that there's corruption going to the highest levels, because I can't validate that there.
Right.
But is there corruption from the perspective that some of the nation members are involved in this activity? Absolutely, and we saw it quite frequently. But a lot of the arguments that I received were focused on the environmental impact. They view the land much differently than we do.
Sure.
They limit the amount of construction on there, and then looking for ancestral burial sites and everything else. But are there members that are on the part of the corrupt aspect? Absolutely.
Well, he laughed as well, because it was as he explained it. I had to laugh with him. He was like, "Well, how do you think it looks to the natives of the country with the Americans now building a wall across their land, saying no one else is allowed in?" And he was like, when if they could have built a wall in the origins of the nation, they probably would have had one built up along the coast, and said, "Hey, why don't you guys just stay back go back to Europe where you're from," and he was kind of just laughing about the immigration factor and people haven't really taken a look at it from the natives' point of view, from the indigenous people, and how it looks to them and how it affects them directly too, in situations where people have, you know, to even the beginning of the origins of this country, we were fleeing to the country in many cases or looking for a better life, and we found what we have now is this great nation. But for a lot of people, it came at a huge detriment, and for large groups of people. And so he kind of laughed it off, but he said, there's definitely a strong feeling. The feelings ran deep in his tribe, is what he said, and he kind of left it at that. So, and I'm sure people can figure that out for themselves. But either way, yeah, the wall there was interesting, and those Brazilians, like you said, they were just moving towards the opening. They knew where they were at because they popped up right at that watering station. Like, do you think that watering station was set up as a humanitarian effort by the U.S. or for people
Well,
that are on the long travel?
not by the U.S., but usually through by a non-government organization or faith-based organizations.
Okay.
They will go out and set up water. what we have on the U.S. side, and again, we talked about the elements out there. Search and rescue is a big portion of what the Border Patrol does during the summer. I mean, we do it year round, but we have invested a lot of effort and resources into the search and rescue because most entities along the southwest border, you're talking about county sheriffs, small police entities, don't have the capability or the resources to perform these rescues. In Tucson, from May through the end of September, sometimes into mid-October, we'll perform, anywhere from as few as 1,500 to sometimes as many as 3,000 rescues. And
that's Tucson. You were in charge of the Tucson section, correct?
Yeah.
And that's from what I remember, that's the largest portion that the department you were in charge of was. If I remember from one of your earlier feeds, you said you had somewhere in the range of like 3,000 people that you were overseeing, and
Yeah.
which was a combination of enlisted law enforcement or what was the term there? Control agents or patrol. I mean, there was a certain amount of admin, but then you had your actual boots on the ground folks that were out there in the field.
Yeah.
That's
So
an
Tucson,
incredibly large stretch.
it is. It's 261 miles of international border with Mexico. Probably just shy of 2/3 of the whole state of Arizona. And I had under my purview at the time about 3,500 sworn law enforcement officers, border patrol agents, about another 300 to 400 civilians that everything from your administrative work, your secretaries, your mechanics, your data entry personnel. It takes a lot to run an operation of that magnitude. And then on top of that, we also had the largest air fleet in CBP and Customs and Border Protection. So, you've
That's
got
like drones, things of that nature.
Yeah, unmanned aerial vehicles, drones, helicopters, Blackhawks, surveillance aircraft. There is a large investment in border security, and at the end of the day, when you hear about it, you think, "Wow, that's a lot." But when you take into consideration the extent and the magnitude of the border, it really is. It's just a drop in the bucket. There's so much more that could be done.
One of the
Now,
comments that just came in about that was real fast. Was how much of I guess the technology and some of the things you have at your disposal there to use for border security is weaponized, or is it mostly just for surveillance purposes?
When you say weaponized, you're talking about the aircraft or the drones, or I'm
Yeah,
not
they
following.
were asking about like the Blackhawks and things of that nature. I mean, do they have mounted weaponry? Just a question that came across, and I'm sure there's probably going to lead with something else, but
Yeah, no. So none of again, it's a law enforcement effort, so it's not military in nature. So when we speak of weapons, it's whatever the agents or pilots, they probably have a pistol, they probably have a long arm,
okay,
but
gotcha.
there's no weaponry that's used towards border enforcement.
Like enforcing. Okay, there you go. Sorry, Jeremy, you were going to say something. I apologize.
well, I was going to sort of steer things towards possible, progress or foreseeable progress when it comes to all of these issues. And
Yeah.
if you were tapped with your experience, you were tapped by an administration It doesn't matter what side they are of the political spectrum, because ultimately the sense that I get from our conversation talking to you that it doesn't necessarily need to line up by an ideology. There has to be some sort of practical solutions and consistency administration to administration. Am I right in saying that? And what would your recommendation then be if you were the guy, if you were tapped to say, hey, tell us what we can do based on your experience to take actionable measures so that the resources go towards enforcement, and then the migration, the immigration, whether it's seasonal and otherwise, the system is so robust that those resources for law enforcement are going in the most efficient way possible. What do we do? You're tapped. What do you say?
So I'm sorry. Go ahead, CJ.
No, I was going to say, like, yes, that's the question is, that's a
Yeah.
lot of answer there, but
Yeah.
you're the man for the task here.
One of the things that we have to look at, though, is, and unfortunately, in this last administration, everything became so politicized. You were over here or over here. There was no in between. And one of the things that with the Border Patrol and most of our law enforcement community is that we're not aligned left or right or tied to a particular administration. We're upholding the laws that are enacted by Congress. Can a particular administration or president change things? Absolutely. We're witnessing it right now. If I was tapped with that role, I mean, first and foremost, what we have to take, we grab everything we have right now, you bundle it up and you just toss it right out the window because it's not working. So we need to make a hearty commitment by our elected officials, by our leadership, to make border security a priority. And with making that a priority, you also have to recognize, again, it's a hand-in-hand border security, border enforcement, and legal migration. Make that investment on the legal migration side, which means do the research so that you develop the right immigrant visas for the right type of population. Make the application process contemporary. In other words, allow people to apply online. Allow them to go to the U.S. consul in that country and start their process for legal migration. At the same time, you have to bolster the rest of the immigration system, which means the immigration courts. We need more judges. So this backlog of 1 million people goes from 1 million to something that's manageable. No one should wait 3, 5, 7, or 10 years to find out whether or not they actually qualify for asylum. The other aspect is we always focus on border enforcement, and we think specifically the Border Patrol or ICE. But we don't recognize that within ICE, there are different components. And one of I think, the greatest shortfalls is there isn't a true investment in the immigration enforcement and removal operations. In other words, if you're going to detain individuals, you should build the facilities for that demographic. You should build facilities so that you can handle the volume and the flow that we're witnessing today. You should also equip both with the resources and the personnel to do that job. So, here in Tucson, there's something like 450 immigration enforcement officers. So, as I mentioned, I've got 3,500. I had 3,500 agents compared to 450 immigration or enforcement officers who do all the detention. It's a pittance, and then they have to do the parole checks and everything else. So, to answer your question, and because we could talk about this probably for a solid hour or more, but we really need Congress to do its job, which is to take a very proactive effort at rebuilding our immigration system, at identifying the mechanisms that are needed so that people can apply in their home countries. They don't have to risk the travel, risk crossing the border illegally, find themselves being exploited by these criminal organizations. So you would root out and curtail a lot of this, the cartels and their ability to finance what they're doing. And then at the same time, you reinvest in border enforcement. And when I talk about border enforcement, we look at the technology. We look at where do we truly need fencing or wall, because we don't need it along every aspect of the southwest border or the northern border. But there are places where we need it. And then you use smart technology so that you can use it as a multiplier. There's simply no way that we could place enough agents along the border to patrol it 24/7. And one of the things, and I get a little backlash from folks who I've worked with over the years, but I'm not going to fault the Biden administration for its efforts at looking at the root causes. But where they fall short is if you're going to go to Central America, and our vice president, I think she made a tremendous gaffe within Guatemala when she talked about the root causes about corruption.
I think
She
she
basically,
said something right here about ICE had their hands side. Kamala compared them to the KKK. I don't
yeah.
know how.
Well,
Yeah,
I mean, it kind of goes in hand in hand. But here she is in front of the Guatemalan president, talking about corruption in the government, corruption in law enforcement, basically telling him he's corrupt and everything he has under his purview is corrupt. And I think she missed that. But the other aspect too is if you're going to make this investment, you have to recognize that it's an investment. You're planting a seed that will not come to fruition for, 10, 20 years. So in the interim, you have to address what's happening today. And this administration thus far is completely ignoring that. We're taking care of it over here, but we're not going to focus on what's happening here. And so this mixed messaging, immediately after Biden was elected, we began to see an increase in the flow of illegal migration and a lack of taking a border enforcement tone just continues to feed that. So even though she's in Guatemala, and I think even in Mexico, she may have made the statement, don't come. When you have people showing up at our borders and when you have them being bussed and flown and housed in hotels and then released into the country, the message that they're telling others is it's okay to come. Because when you come, you're treated well, and you're going to be released into the United States. So they have to get their talking points down, and then they have to back it up with actions.
man, I think you're hitting it on the head too with everything that when we look at it from like the long game, right? And I get that what they're trying to do, from what I'm seeing in my take, is we're trying to fix the long game based off of the history game, things that were done throughout historically that got us to where we're at. And now we're trying to stem the flow. But they're dropping, what was it, $4 billion? They said they're going to try to do in Guatemala alone to try to stop what's the root cause of all of this rapid influx of immigration. When I mean, it's almost like putting a band-aid on some problems that we've actually started and things that we've caused. And then now we're saying that's great in 10 years, like you said, 15 years, 20 years. But we were talking about this demarcation point, like this border, which is where the problem is happening. Like that's where the issue is. We try to fix a country, that's great, but we're having an issue at our own border right now. That, like you said, if we're going to reinvest into the enforcement of that border, it doesn't just go along with people. I think are assuming that what I've seen that's just about building more walls. And like, yeah, we need more security, and it's like Jeremy's mentioned, we need more robust, like plans for helping people to get the proper type of immigration, to helping people get like the legal services that they need at the border, to getting the programs in place that are going to help these children get the types of housing that they need, the situations that will get them to safer, dwellings, get them to where they belong, get them with the people they belong with, take a lot of the focus out of this political overarching viewpoint, which is missing, as you said right when we started. The real crisis is the humanitarian aspect of it,
Yeah.
which is there's people right now that are suffering and dying, not so much just because they want to steal a job, as people have said, from an American, that dream of America, but they're trying to get away from a nightmare that is their home, and so in that, we as a nation have the opportunity to help. Why would we not? And in a place where a lot of people get mad about it because they say things like, "Well, you don't live in a border state," or you're not affected by it. And I have to remind them, Canada's a border of my state, so I have to deal with these guys all the time with their maple syrup, their geese, their loonies, and no, I'm kidding. But
Well, see, down here we get the snowbirds from Canada every year, so that, there's
Right.
a different level of migration. But everything you said is accurate. The other thing that we have to recognize in the United States is that what happens at the border, and again, I said it's very dynamic, very fluid, does not stay at the border. It travels and transits through the entire United States. And it used to be that they went to central locations, LA, Chicago, New York. Now, and I had a conversation with the Mexican consul shortly before retiring, both the Mexican and Guatemalan consul, and they're in places they had never been before. They're setting up consulates in Tennessee, in Ohio, North Carolina, places they had never, ever gone to before, because now they have large scale communities that have since migrated there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, we definitely have to do a better job. It is a humanitarian issue. And like I said, if you address the humanitarian aspect, it enables the border security function and focus to remain border security.
Yeah. What do you think about the focus? And I live in Seattle. That's my home state, and I started off doing what I do, and a lot of the the conflict up in the Northwest. And now one of the focal points for a lot of the things that you've been seeing up in Portland, especially, is the ice building up in Portland. And, it's like a regular thing. They go to the ice, march to the ice building. It's spray painted. It's vandalized. It's more or less kind of put under siege for a period of time. What is it about the ice that you feel has become such a villainized aspect of the community of border enforcement?
It's funny because I joke around with some of my ICE friends. When I started in the Border Patrol, people hated the Border Patrol. We were there were corridas, Mexican songs that were written about the Border Patrol and how horrendous the Border Patrol was. And ICE has now, and gladly for me, because I love the Border Patrol, has gladly assumed that title of being the villains, of being the bad guys. Of the United States, they're going after folks with warrants who have committed crimes. In regards to what's going on in Seattle and kind of holding that federal building siege, I think it's more politics, and I think it may have lost whatever the initial intent was, and now it's become sort of a rhythmic effort at I'm not even sure what the message is today, but ICE serves a function. But one of the things that we also have to look at with ICE is that it's not just the immigration aspect, because they're also dealing with gangs. They're dealing with child exploitation. They're dealing with narcotics, weapon trafficking. So, they serve a very vital function, but people are only focusing on the negative aspect because it's what sells. It's what people gravitate towards,
Yeah. 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 And that's, I mean, honestly, it comes down to a personal narrative and an overarching narrative that you see in a lot of media, but whatever fits into that play, and I think it comes down to the title. So Immigration Customs Enforcement, right? Am I saying it right?
Yeah. Immigration Customs Enforcement.
And then you got Border Patrol. So one is, I mean, even in that last one is, enforcement, law enforcement. It's going to come down to more of a, I'm going to say a boots on the ground situation as far as like in the law aspect of it. Whereas then you've got the patrol is, like you said, almost half your time, if not more, is spent in humanitarian efforts trying to save the rescue missions to get people out of the deserts and out of these, mountainous areas that they otherwise aren't going to make it out of. But did you feel personally in your time in the Border Patrol, and you've, I mean, 32 years is impressive, and I commend you for your efforts and the things that I'm sure that you've seen and had to deal with. I from what I've talked to and other people, I mean, you've had to, I'm sure, deal with some pretty horrific situations, and even touched on it just here with having to deal with the human trafficking aspect of it and seeing how these lives are affected. What would you say is one of the questions is the common man, like, what is it that we can do here in society as a whole that would help better play into giving us hope moving from our borders to the heartland?
I mean, one of the biggest things is just conversation, having a conversation. We lost that ability in the last few years to have just a simple conversation about what we're witnessing, what's going on, and recognizing, again, the complexity of the border, the complexity of migration, both legal and illegal, and everything involved with it is exactly that. It's just so complex that you can't put your finger on a singular aspect and think that you understand it well enough. Even me, after 32 years, I'm realizing that there are things that I overlooked, and I certainly got exposed to a lot of different things. But one of the aspects as a young agent, you're really focused on the border enforcement, and then as you mature and progress, you start realizing the humanitarian aspect, and then you start looking at the politics that affect it, and not just in the U.S. but the world as a whole. You become more in tune to, or I should say, attuned to the world as a whole, because you're picking up on when an economy fails in Brazil, or there's civil strife in Sudan, or corruption is so rampant in the Ukraine, that you start to realize, okay, now I have to be on the lookout, because what used to take longer for travel, it'd be weeks when you start seeing people from these countries show up. And in your clip with the Brazilians, they mentioned they traveled for 3 days. A lot of what's happening today is they have the ability now. Travel is much more affordable. They have the ability to fly from Brazil into Mexico City, and then from Mexico City to Tijuana or Mexicali or Nogales. So they're at the immediate border in a very short period of time.
Right.
And then you have others, when you looked at the caravan a couple of years ago, who make that migration and trek and will walk and take public transportation. So, I mean, you see the full spectrum, those that have the capabilities to travel by plane and those that are using everyday public resources. It's just, we need to converse about it. We need to be able to acknowledge that there isn't a singular solution, but something has to be done. And we need to put pressure on elected officials. They have to wake up and realize that you can't sit on one side or the other. You have to be willing to compromise. You have to be willing to have a conversation. And we have to do what's good for our government. Because until they accept that, we're not going to see a tremendous amount of change. And if we want to make these investments in other countries, so be it. That's great, but we have to do it wisely. You can't drop, and $4 billion sounds like a lot of money, but when you look at the scheme of things, $4 billion in the country of Guatemala today, and then there's no future support. And we planted a seed, we put some water on it, and then we walked away. It's not going to thrive.
So we have a vacuum effect there too, right?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Let me ask you, and it's one that came up earlier, and it came up a few times, and I didn't touch on it because I feel like we've been hitting on some incredible points. We haven't really talked much about the drug trafficking, about how have you seen that change in light of the current administration and the way that border policies have changed?
Yeah. So trafficking, and this is interesting because I did my master's thesis on this, and
there we go.
Up until up until the mid 90s, really, when you looked at border security or border enforcement, it was all about illegal migration. There was really no focus on the threat of narcotics. So Ronald Reagan comes into play, and we start our war on drugs, and Nancy Reagan with the red lapels, and it's about the mid 1990s, 94, 96, that border security is intertwined with not just illegal migration, but also stemming the flow of narcotics into the U.S. And that's when you, again, under the Clinton administration, you see this infusion of funding for manpower and technology and infrastructure. And from that period on, up until 2001, with the horrendous events of 9/11, border security then became synonymous with stopping or stemming the flow of illegal narcotics. And, we were witnessing, up until marijuana got legalized, we were seizing, anywhere from 1.5 million to 3 million pounds of marijuana along the southwest border. Heroin, cocaine, methamphetamine. I mean, that was just the norm. Since marijuana,
fentanyl is a big one now, right? Like fentanyl is coming over by the
fentanyl is huge. I was in San Diego in 2017, and Southern California, for border enforcement activity, accounted for almost 60% of all hard narcotics: methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin, and fentanyl. I came to Tucson in 2018, I lose track of time here. I think it's 2018, 2019. And Tucson had long been the central point for marijuana. But then it got legalized. And so what we saw was a very quick diffusion of the flow of marijuana into the U.S. We would see cannabis oil. Then very rapidly, the cartels adjusted, and we started to see an infusion or influx of hard narcotics. And whereas in California, you would see fentanyl in powder form, here in Arizona, what the cartels are doing is they've got pill presses, and they're actually pressing the fentanyl into pills. We call them M80s because they're little blue pills. And this does two things. One is it enables the smugglers to carry a greater quantity, because now you're not carrying a pound or 100 pounds, but you're carrying 10 or 100,000 pills, and you can put that in a backpack. We saw a lot of body carriers, people that would strap it to themselves, or people that would put it in body cavities. But fentanyl, right before I retired, was becoming an increasing illicit drug that we were seeing here in Arizona. And both people bringing it through the port of entries, through our checkpoints, and then also between the ports of entry, where what we mentioned earlier, where the cartels would charter these buses and drop people off. Well, simultaneously, they would have a group of 5 or 6, a team of narcotic smugglers. And of these 5 or 6, each person had their own role. Somebody would carry marijuana because it's big, it's bulky, and it's visible. Somebody would carry a small backpack with resources, food, water. Somebody would carry the hard narcotics, the meth or the fentanyl. Somebody carried their radios for communication. One of the things that the cartels do is they have a logistic or supply chain from Mexico, and again, when you traverse along the from Mexico in Arizona, on the Arizona side, you've got stretches that are 70, 80 miles long before you come across anything that's urbanized. And so they have logistic points that are set up where somebody is guiding them in, resupplying them with water, fresh batteries, and food. So when the Border Patrol would shift to take care of the families and the kids, you would have this group that would come through and then try to make it because they recognize that there's less enforcement going on. And then if as an agent, you are able to respond, this group, again, they had their roles. The guy with the hard narcotics, the fentanyl or the meth, his job was to get away at all costs, and everybody else would do everything in their power to make sure that he got away. So, that meant the guy with the marijuana was running straight to the Border Patrol agents, and the other guys were doing whatever they could to distract that agent while the guy with the fentanyl would get away. So, as it relates to narcotics, it continues to be a threat. It amazes me that the government hasn't reacted more harshly towards the smuggling or trafficking of fentanyl, because it doesn't take a lot to kill a whole bunch of people.
Right.
And it's
Now, I
certainly,
gotta think. Sorry, go ahead, please.
I was going to say, it's certainly decimated large portions of our country. And not only the fentanyl, but the methamphetamine. I mean, it doesn't stay at the border. It's everywhere in the U.S.
Right. Now, some of the things that I think people it just kind of is dawning on me right now. We're talking about legalizing marijuana. Down on the border, you've had, decades. I'm not trying to age it, but I'm saying you got decades of experience here under your belt. Were you expecting some kind of change at the border? I mean, was this something that you guys thought when you're looking at the analytics, like, all right, great, they're going to have to replace with some. These supply chains got to be filled. They're making their money. They're going to have to figure something else out. And then when they started decriminalizing a lot of the drugs here in the United States, where they're, heroin, meth, a lot of these things now where you're just getting tickets for having possession charges now. Did that change a lot of the influx of the border, the trafficking that you saw at the border?
Absolutely. And so one of the things that I learned over 3 decades of border enforcement is that, again, it's dynamic, it's fluid, it's ever changing, and you're trying to be predictive and to what is the cartel going to do next? What's the next threat? And so with the legalization of marijuana, very rapidly we saw in certain areas of the border, a cessation of smuggling of marijuana. And cartels, again, they're a business. So they're looking for their next commodity. What is it they're going to transport, smuggle to bring cash flow into the organization? And so they shifted into, again, the hard narcotics, the heroin, the meth, and now the fentanyl. I will give them this. They are what's the word I'm looking for?
Sharp as a tack, business
Sharp as
savvy.
a tack, great entrepreneurs.
Industrious.
Industrious.
Yeah,
Thank you.
there it is.
They shifted very quickly because for the longest time, fentanyl, you're only getting it out of China. These cartels, they learned how to, first it was get it out of China, and then they learned how to begin producing it themselves. I mean, again, if you're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry, hiring a chemist or buying a lab outright, very feasible for these organizations. So they remove the Chinese aspect of having to rely on them to import the fentanyl to producing it themselves. And then, as I said, buying pill presses and pressing the fentanyl and then sending it across the border. And that was one of the cases before I left. Let me take a step back there because I don't know if that case is wrapped up yet. But one of the things that we took note of was
I don't want someone showing up at my house with a black bag putting over my head. All right, so don't get me and Jeremy caught up in something.
Absolutely. Yeah, one of the things we noticed is that they began to use pill presses, and it just changed. Talking about the change and ever evolution, they certainly do. They're industrious.
And just
Did you see it? Oh, sorry, go ahead, Jeremy.
We've never, when you talk about all of the exploitation from the border and the cartels and so forth, we never talk about the demand, which is that without a demand within our borders for the product, then of course this isn't as big of a crisis. So what needs to, when it comes to the war on drugs, we've been taken through so many stages of is it, is it education? What is the component that we're missing as far as curbing the demand that seems to be so consistent? And is it not just consistent? Has it been growing? Has the demand from the United States actually increased when it comes to these types of illicit drugs?
Yeah, and that's the thing is so when I'd mentioned that when you look at border enforcement on the Mexican side, you've got a Mexican law enforcement community, and then a larger part is the Mexican military. And one of the conversations I had with I forget the general's name, but we were talking about border enforcement, and he very pointedly said to me, he goes, Roy, you come and you make these demands about how we help you stem the flow of narcotics into the U.S. He goes, but the U.S. government, doesn't help us with the remittances, the aftermath of what's coming back, i.e., the money, the ability to infuse the cartels with weapons, and the capability to corrupt officials, the capability to buy chemists. And it was at that point that it really I felt kind of naive, because this is probably less than 7 years ago. So I've already got 20 plus years, 25 years in the Border Patrol. And I felt really naive to think that for the longest time, I was only concerned about what was impacting the U.S. and not looking, and I think CJ mentioned this earlier, but not looking south. How does it impact that community? So when we talk about border enforcement and mention of what we do in the U.S., part of what we also have to do is we have to look into Mexico and these other countries. How do we help them develop a system that addresses immigration, both from the enforcement aspect and for the legal migration aspect? Somebody had asked, I saw one of the comments about was there an impact with COVID on narcotics? Yeah. And there was, very interesting, because the flow of illegal migrants coming between the ports of entry diminished, and so when you have people crossing illegally, you have the ability to blend into that flow of people. When COVID impacted us and we shut down the border, that flow went away. So what happened was a lot of these smugglers then shifted to the ports of entry. So we saw an increase of narcotic flow at the ports of entry. So a lot of concealed narcotic loads, fabricated vehicles, some what we call clone vehicles, a vehicle that's painted to look like a service provider, CenturyLink or something like that. And then, they drive it across the border loaded up with drugs. So yes,
you're going to say painted to look like a zebra. I was hoping something like that, but
I've seen all kind of things. I've seen people, I mentioned camouflage. What amazed me when I came to Arizona was that a lot of the migrants that we were witnessing were dressed in head to toe in camouflage. Matter of fact, the first time I walked into one of my stations, the question I asked was like, "Oh, are these new trainees?" And like, "No, Chief, these are all migrants that we just arrested." And it completely baffled me, because I had never witnessed that before. So in Arizona, south of us, there's an industry that provides every aspect of clothing that you need in camouflage: your backpacks, your pants, your shoes, hats, everything, because when you're walking across the desert, it helps you blend into the environment. And again, we've got a very robust air fleet here. So with the unmanned aerial vehicles, the helicopters, they wear camouflage to blend into the environment.
Yeah, you touched on something that I really want to know from you, because we've hit some pretty heavy points, but I was looking for one of the comments in here, because someone was actually breaking down that they had a news team over in Mexico that was following somebody around that was actually shopping for that exact thing, for the backpacks, the whole nine, and it was up quite a bit earlier. But you've seen some crazy stuff. I'm sure you've seen some stuff that you wish you could have talked about, but being as how you've not been able to, you got to have a story. Give us I'd love to hear a highlight, like something from you that, not just like an anecdote, but a high point for you in your career, or something where you felt like, my 32 years I've been here, like I made an impact, like something in your line that really made you feel whole and complete in the position. Because obviously you got to have a lot of passion for what you do, or you wouldn't have stuck it out as long as you have. So, and I'm curious about that for you.
Yeah. So it's actually a combination of things. It's a low point that turned into a high point. I was assigned to headquarters in Washington, D.C., and this was in the early 2000s. And this is when we began again, this was after the Clinton administration began to focus on border security. And so we saw a shift in the flow of migration from San Diego, from urbanized areas into rural areas. And so as a result of that, we're witnessing an increase in the number of border deaths. People are ill-prepared. One of the things that I didn't mention earlier is that a lot of folks show up to the border completely ill-prepared for the environment. Not enough water, not enough food. And again, for the smugglers, this is a commodity. I'm not concerned about your well-being. I just want to get as many of these pieces of humans across so that I can collect my money.
Do they only get paid when they get across the border? That's something I didn't ask you earlier. Or do people hold that cash until they make it safely and then?
A little bit of both. So depending upon the amount of cash, in some cases, they may pay upfront, which isn't the norm. They'll usually make a down payment and then they'll collect as they go along. Sometimes what happens is the smugglers at the stash house will then contact the family and say, "Hey, I've got CJ here. You still owe me $3,000, so I need that within 24 hours." So I've witnessed cases where families couldn't produce it in that period of time, and they'll take a person right back to the border and drop them off. In some cases, there's a beating that accompanies that to send a message. So I've witnessed that also. But a lot of times, what happens, we talk about higher rates, that $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 mark. You're looking at indentured servitude. And we see a lot of that with Indian nationals, where they're, again, $40,000 to $80,000, and they're working that money off. We've seen it in the service industry, in the hotel industry in particular, where they're working at a hotel to pay off this debt, and they work it off for 10, 20 years. But going back to the highlight for me, so the low light was I was in headquarters, and the border deaths began to increase, and there was a focus on it. So much so that at the time it was President George Bush. And so much so that he was getting briefed on a daily basis. And there were two major events that took place that shaped part of what I did over the next few years. There was a case down in Houston, I believe, where there were 17 undocumented aliens in the back of a tractor trailer. And the smuggler drove up, parked the trailer, and walked away. And this is in the middle of the summer. Of the 17, 16 of them were all young adults, and there was a father and his child. And if you haven't been in the back of a tractor trailer, it's insulated. It gets hot very quickly.
You mean like an 18-wheeler?
Like an 18-wheeler, yeah. Okay. Like an 18-wheeler. I'm sorry, I should have clarified.
Okay. No,
so, I mean, in their desperation, everyone stripped down to their underwear. And when they were finally discovered, it was the dad and his son. He was probably 2 years old in his diaper. On the back of the tractor trailers, you've got these doors that open up, right? The refrigerator trailers. Mm-hmm. And at the bottom, there's a small door that they could open to look inside. Pure desperation. Dad had his son shoved up to that little door and had clawed as much as he could to try to open it up. His fingernails were ripped off and bloody. And they died. They asphyxiated from the lack of oxygen, from the heat. And it was those images that started me on my path towards. And at the time, the Border Patrol was working on search and rescue, but it wasn't organized or orchestrated in a standardized manner. And then there was a second incident where in Yuma, Arizona, a large group of undocumented migrants had crossed. It was about 20 to 30 miles east of Yuma, and I forget. It was something like 13 or 15 of them that had died out there. And so that started me on my path towards developing a standardized search and rescue entity for the Border Patrol. And part of that was a comprehensive effort, which was the Border Safety Initiative. So we started messaging campaigns, public service announcements in the U.S. so that we could, get family members to recognize the dangers and then relay that back to their family members in Mexico and Guatemala. We also did public service announcements in Mexico, Guatemala. And then the thing that I'm most proud of is we developed what's known as BORSTAR, the Border Patrol Search and Rescue Unit. The men and women in BORSTAR are trained at an EMT 3-level paramedic level. They can perform swift water rescue, desert rescue, rappelling out of helicopters off the sides of cliffs, you name it. These men and women can perform a rescue anywhere. And we were able to standardize that in 2000. And we started shortly after 2001. And by 2003, we had that standardized and implemented across the entire southwest border. And so when I retired somewhere in the realm of about 40,000 rescues that these men and women had performed. So
Wow,
for me,
man.
that was probably the pinnacle of my career, knowing that I was able to put something together, launch it, and it's still to this day a viable function of the Border Patrol.
That's amazing. How do you feel about them giving you the title, the porn stars?
Say again.
One of the border patrol agents we talked to, he gave us a lot of different, tags that he've given different departments, and I guess the Boar stars they call the porn stars was what he was referring to your guys' outfit, the search and rescue
Yeah.
guys.
So part of it is they used to be referred to as the Golden Boys because one of the things, if you're going to perform a rescue, you've got to be mentally coherent. And then you also have to be physically in
Right,
great shape because the last thing you want to do is send somebody out to perform a rescue who then has to be rescued.
right.
And they're carrying individuals for miles at a time. They're out in the heat. So I've never heard them referred to as porn stars, but the Golden Boys, because we invest a lot of money and time in their training.
Yeah.
And when you look at, again, what sells as it relates to media, it's something that's sexy. And when you rescue somebody, and particularly some of the types of rescues that they perform, it gets
Sure.
attention, it gets media coverage.
Yeah. Now, are they coming from other departments of the military or law enforcement typically and make a migration, or are these guys that are just coming in, men and women and otherwise, that are looking to just play a part and doing something to help?
Yeah, so these are Border Patrol agents. These are men and women
Oh, okay.
who
So
have
I
joined
do.
the U.S. Border Patrol, and they have found a calling in the search and rescue aspect.
Oh, so okay, so it is like another entity within your border patrol.
Yeah, so like within the Border Patrol, you've got the Boar Star, the Border Patrol Search, Trauma, and Rescue. You have BORTAS, our SWAT team. We've got an intelligence division, training, horse patrol, ATVs, motorcycles. Up on the northern border, we've got snowmobiles. In Miami, you've got boat patrol. So there's a bunch of different facets within the Border Patrol that you can actually partake in after receiving training.
Yeah. One of the questions just came in, which is interesting. Well, before I even touch on that, that's amazing, and I want to tell you how incredible it is that at an early point in your career, you're able to start something that, and I think a lot of people and I know in my community, we talk a lot about this, can appreciate and can take into account that you don't have to make a world changing effort. Like, you can change something locally that you can actually touch and is tangible in your world, and plant a seed there, and it can make some real amazing impact. So, I mean, I applaud you to know that 40,000 rescues have come from the efforts of a sacrifice, which is sad to say, of some things that you had to experience inspired you to do a change in the system in a big way. And so I think it's phenomenal that you were able to step up and do that. So again, tons of accolade, and I think it's amazing that you're able to do that. But question for you though, and I still want to hear some of your crazy. I need to hear at least one or two crazy stories, because I know you've got some where you've just been like, somebody got turned into a pineapple tree or something, and they shipped across the border in the back of a truck, whatever. I don't know, but someone is asking right here. Stephanie is asking how do they build these tunnels undetected, like these border tunnels?
Oh,
How does
man.
that happen?
So border tunnels, I mean, that's a reality of what we deal with, and the technology we have isn't. You would think that we'd have the capability to detect tunnels, but isn't as well developed as we are, as is available in the commercial market. We've spent some time. So if you look at the government of Israel, they contend with tunnels on a regular basis. So we've actually partnered with them to look at their technology and their tunnel detection capabilities. So I would say that the U.S. government and the Border Patrol is still working towards developing better technology to detect tunnels. But at the end of the day, a lot of times what happens is the old-fashioned, boots on the ground doing good patrol work. Some of the telltale things that we look for and we've learned over time is we have the ability to look south into Mexico. So you start looking for areas where you see, a great example when I was in El Centro in Mexico, across from us is Mexicali. And so we would watch the border. And if you would see, and again, this is right at the immediate border, if you start noticing that there's a house that is sense as to why would they be taking truckloads of dirt away from this house? Now you're a little bit suspicious as to what's happening. So
It's not a basement swimming pool.
It's not a basement pool. So you'd start working with the Mexican officials to try to do surveillance and stop it before it got built. In other cases, it old-fashioned snitches. I mean, we're paying people, confidential informant, and they will rat on their competition to shut down their tunnel. In some cases, the tunneling is done in such a manner. This is, you asked about stories. There was a lady in the city of Calexico who would call us every night, and she would tell us, I hear people underneath my house. I can hear people. You need to come out. And this went on for 2 or 3 weeks. And it started when she was in her backyard and then progressively got to her house. And finally, we sent a couple agents over because she was so persistent. And the agents were standing inside her kitchen. And sure as heck, they could hear the tunneling underneath them. So at that point, you start the investigation, and we work with ICE and other entities, and you kind of figure out where they're going. Because again, multi-billion-dollar industry. So what do the cartels do? They rent or they buy houses on the north side of the border, and they will put caretakers into those homes until they get the tunnel completed.
So would you let that tunnel get completed just so you can kind of monitor the tunnel, or do you just, like you deal with moles, you just kind of like put a garden hose in there and try to fill it up? Like, what do you do?
It depends. Sometimes if there's an active investigation already taking place, then you may let the tunnel go to fruition so that they can, if they're investigating it, then they probably have the hierarchy built so that they plan on making arrest. So you would let that be completed, and then it'll work on arrest and prosecution. In other cases, we'll try to figure out, triangulate where that tunnel's out, and then we'll mitigate it by drilling into the tunnel, which then exposes it. Well, we don't want to collapse it because we don't know who's in there. So you're drilling in there. It's more of a, hey, we know you're here, which then they'll cease, and you'll work with the Mexican government, and then we'll go into the tunnel, we'll map it out, and then we'll fill it with concrete.
I mean, are these tunnels, are they pretty well structured? I mean, they're built like a mining tunnel type. I mean, they've got to be, you got $1 billion industry, you're going to be able to invest in some good digging equipment, I'd imagine.
You see everything from very rudimentary tunnels, that someone with a pick and a shovel is in there, to very complex tunnels. Early on, when we began to witness tunneling, one of the, I got to think this through and make sure it's not, one of the telltale signs is we began to pick up on, they were using certain crews. They would fly people in from particular countries, and their job was specifically to build a tunnel. In one instance, they got so brazen they decided to try to build it. They were building it simultaneously in the U.S. and Mexico, and we captured the crew. Well, we didn't capture the crew. We captured the house taker on the U.S. side, and we led that back into Mexico, and they seized the drilling machine. And this is high-tech technology that's used in commercial mining. And so they seized it, and where they were headed to was a recently, not abandoned, but it was a very small strip mall, and the company went out of business. And this investor came in and bought the whole strip mall. And I'm going to build X, Y, and Z. Well, what he was doing was buying time because they're building a tunnel into the strip mall. And so we ended up seizing, the strip mall, arresting him, and then the Mexicans seized this drilling machine. And we talked about corruption earlier, and we thought, hey, high fives, great job. Well, lo and behold, about a year later, we do another detection, we make another arrest, and that same drilling press was back online. So they had seized it.
It was rented from the city department. They were using it for parks work. The guy's like, oh man, I just didn't know what they were doing with it.
Yeah, but to answer your question again, very rudimentary tunnels to extremely sophisticated tunnels. One of the tunnels that I was in was 70 feet down. I could stand up and walk through it. There was railway in there so that you could push a cart through. There was ventilation, lights.
70 feet down to the tunnel, and then that's insane.
Yeah. Man. Yeah. And so, I mentioned, the different things that Border Patrol agents do. We also have, they refer to themselves as the tunnel rats. And these are agents that are trained in tunnel detection, the mapping of tunnels. And this is what they do on a daily basis is they go into, when we discover a tunnel, they work with the Mexican government. They start on the U.S. side. Sometimes, I'll stop there. Then they will map out that tunnel so that we can mitigate it, fill it with concrete, or do an investigation.
Man, I tell you, I tried to put in a a mailbox post not too long ago, and that took me almost all day, and that was just with a lot of blisters and profanity. I can't imagine going down 70 feet just to start your job. That's
Yeah.
insanity.
So this is, in law enforcement, you build a sense of humor over things that sometimes are not perceived as funny, but you deal with so much stuff. When we talk about tunnels, there was, this is again, I was in El Centro at the time. There was a gentleman who, if you've been to El Centro, the All-American Canal parallels the border. And the smuggling organization decided that they were going to build a tunnel underneath the canal. And the digging team calculated the depth of the canal. And so they pierced the canal bank. And of course, all that water rushed in there, flooded in there, and killed them all.
Oh, wow.
We also had a guy, and I'm pretty sure I'm going to get backlash over this, but I'm retired, so I'm going to say it. I'm going to share this story with you. We refer to him as Scuba Steve because he had built a similar tunnel, but his intent was go into the water, and then he would float along the canal and deliver his narcotics to the pickup team. And we refer to him as Scuba Steve because he wore scuba gear. Unfortunately,
he just float around the canal there.
Yeah, so he dug his tunnel, breached it into the canal, and then he would take the narcotics, wrap it around his body, use his tunnel into the canal, surface up, and then just float, because the All-American Canal flows extremely fast, and he would float along for quarter mile, half a mile. He'd meet his pickup team, drop off the narcotics, and then he would make his way back into Mexico. And the only reason we found out about Scuba Steve is one day, I'm not sure what happened. He got confused, made a mistake, didn't refill his tank, but he ended up drowning. And we found him there with the narcotics strapped to him. And so we went back and, as I mentioned, it's not just border wall, but it's infrastructure, it's technology. So we have cameras up along the border. So we started reviewing footage, and sure as heck, we picked up on the fact that Scuba Steve had been doing this for quite some time. It just completely under our noses, because when you're looking in that water, it's dark, it's murky, it's at night, and he's in complete scuba gear. You're not expecting to have somebody just cruise along.
It was a dead giveaway when you saw some guy in flippers in a scuba tank crawling out of a canal and walking over to a Daewoo Lardos to drive home. I would imagine that's what it looked like.
Yeah, well, what he did again, he would just he'd swim up to the bank and just. And then because there's a lot of agriculture out there, oh my gosh, I forget the term in Spanish, but there are canals that they use to water the fields out there, and
irrigation ditches and stuff.
Yeah, so the irrigation, oh my gosh, handler, he was on the take, and so what he would do is he'd drive up, and it looked like he was handling the water in the flow, and he'd just pick up the narcotics and transport them.
Wow.
But yeah, it's such a big industry, and there's everybody's in it. They're industrious, they're innovative in what they do. At one point we were dealing with ultralights, the small aircraft with kind of like a lawnmower motor on the back of it, and they would fly up and over and drop 10, 20, a couple 100 pounds of marijuana or narcotics on the U.S. side. A pickup team would show up, pick it up, and take off.
Do you see drones doing that nowadays? Because drones can carry weight now. They have I had a buddy who had a drone, a couple $1,000s. And he would fly it around, but it would carry stuff around. He could deliver things, and it would follow his car, or the remote control rather, when he was in his car. And then he messed up, and the thing fell out of the sky and landed on his car and destroyed this car. But that was another story. But it was the first time I'd ever seen you see these small drones, but this was came in a big suitcase. It had a whole, I don't know what his game plan was with it, but I would imagine that's probably a tool that smugglers would want to use at this point in time.
Absolutely. So that's probably one of the greatest threats that in the scheme of things, there are a lot of threats, but that's one of the larger threats that I think is ongoing right now. We began to witness that a few years ago. As you mentioned, first it was small packages, then it became larger packages. But it's not only for the illicit introduction of narcotics, but it's also for counter surveillance. It's also for the movement of people, because now that we have drones that can go up for 30 minutes, an hour, sometimes longer than that, you can actually facilitate the movement of people or narcotics, and or just conduct counter surveillance. And again, with this multi-billion-dollar industry, they absolutely do counter surveillance to the point that they recognize agents who they may not know what their name is, but they know, CJ comes on at 5 o'clock, and from 5 to 6, CJ is very attentive, and then he takes his lunch, and then he gets a little lethargic. So, at 6:30, we're running something through, and they know CJ's days off, and they're very, very systematic at what they do.
They
You
probably
train.
have nicknames as well
Oh yeah.
that they've conceived for the other side. I'm looking at some of the comments here, and someone's mentioning just how unjaded you seem to be through your experience. Is there something, as you sort of handed off your experience to others? This might be a good way to sort of tie it up. What did you impart to those who sort of succeeded from your work, and what is it that you sort of would want to see?
For me, one of the biggest things that I spent the latter part of my career in leadership, and then the last 10 years, 12 years in executive leadership. And at that point, it becomes the issue of, or the aspect of, what are you leaving behind as your legacy, and mentorship becomes a big thing. So I looked at mentorship on a multitude of avenues. One is preparing my agents for the job that they're undertaking, and recognizing the complexity of it, and also trying to break them away from becoming jaded towards what they're dealing with, recognizing that we're dealing with humanity, recognizing that you're dealing with people that in some cases are escaping the worst conditions possible, whether it's the economy, civil war, gangs, or just simply food deprivation or a lack of economic opportunity. But being compassionate about doing your job. One of the things that I realized before I retired, I mentioned earlier that when I joined the Border Patrol, it was sort of this nefarious bad guy. These corridas and ballads were sung about us, and we were just villains. And before I retired, and I told the story before because it had an impact on me, I went down to the border, and this was during the caravan crisis, and there was a Honduran mom with her little girls. And I had approached her to have a conversation with her because I just wanted to find out what her travel was like, and what her ordeal was. And tears are streaming down her eyes, and she's crying, and her little girl runs up and just grabs my leg, and I am looking at mom, and I can just see this instant relief of, we've made it, we're safe now. And so when you look at the ordeal that they've gone through, and recognizing that the perception of the Border Patrol has gone from these hard-nosed bad people to saviors, and you're going to be okay when you see that green uniform, they're going to take care of you, was monumental for me. So I try to impart that on my agents, to recognize that we're dealing with humanity, being in tune with what's going on in the world. And then the other aspect is I recognize that, kind of like a gardener, I'm planting a seed, and I may not get to see the fruition of that seed as it develops into, whatever it is, that flower or that yielding vegetable. But I'm planting a seed that I hope is going to better the Border Patrol, but at the same time is going to better our country and the efforts underhand for border security.
Man,
Thank
Roy,
you.
I got to tell you, and I think we're going to wrap now, but I think you hit it on one of the best notes that we could possibly end it on, which is a legacy. And I think right now, we here in America, and anyone that's watching anywhere else, can appreciate that you can start a legacy today, and you can make an impact today on someone's life. And it doesn't have to be, like I said, some macro effort. It can be some micro processor that just helps you and the world you exist in, and the world that other people exist in, move a little bit better, a little bit freer, a little bit healthier, safer, happier. And man, and I can't thank you enough for taking the time today. I know we took a little longer of your time than I think we had originally anticipated. But man, the like I said, I'm still in awe, man. Like of the things you were able to accomplish and what you were able to do. So thank you so much for taking the time to talk with me and Jeremy today. I know that the outpouring of in the comments, people are just incredibly grateful for not just your services, but for your view on the humanitarian aspect of what's really going on at the border to the south of America.
So, well, thank you guys for the opportunity, and as I mentioned earlier, for your viewers out there, look up the Border Patrol on social media. if you'd like to get the true sense of what's going on, a lot of what they post relates to what's happening on the border today. It's contemporary. It's not jaded. The Border Patrol tries not to, is apolitical, so you're gonna get the truth out of them. I took a temporary hiatus from social media because I'm working on a separate project right now, but I'm out there also, and I'm trying to do the same thing. I want to enlist these conversations. So thank you guys for the opportunity. And should you want to reach out for any more information, please feel free to do so. And please keep on encouraging these conversations.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Roy. I guarantee we will. And Jeremy, thank you so much for everything you've done to tag team with us on this immersion into our best efforts and understanding what's going on at the border. Roy, you've been incredibly informative, and I'm sure we'll be in touch here very soon.
Sounds great. Take care, guys.
All right, you guys. Have a great
Thanks
night.
so much.
And Roy, happy late Father's Day to you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
Bye-bye, guys.
All right, y'all.
Bye-bye.
Take care, everybody. Be good.